kind of review the process. We're at a public comment period. I'm going to kind of go through what's been done and what the expectation is going forward. Some of us, we drafted some bills for general purposes to bring ideas forward. They got out pretty late. We've reviewed drafts and different drafts, and that got out pretty late Friday. There's no intent for us to work these bills in the sense of actually making a motion, moving them, formally amending them, and then sending them on to another committee today. My intent is to have a discussion about the ideas in these bills. If there's consensus around adding something else into a bill, then we'll do that. If there's some more further ideas, we'll examine those. The idea would really be to expand on this and add more ideas. Obviously, we can subtract or delete pieces of them when we actually work them. And then the object would be to allow these to be people to have formed comments on them in the next week. I believe, Brian, are you on? I believe that we have another meeting kind of established for the 16th. Is that correct, Brian?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. June 16th at 8:30.
Okay, so thank you, Brian. So the idea would be to accept public comment on these ideas that we developed, that we add to today, and then we would come back and we would take more formal public comment on all of those bills, any bills we had drafted. And then we would work those and send them on to a committee. The committee will probably be Management Council. Then obviously Management Council would also have the same process where bills would be posted. Public would have the opportunity to comment. And then a decision would be made whether any of these bills would move forward, which ones would move forward perhaps to a special session, or which ones may move forward to a full session. So that's kind of the idea. I know we have some public comment. I would rather take all of that public comment before we look at these drafts, because there could be ideas in that public comment that we may want to flesh out in the next week. So that'd be our opportunity to hear from the public and to add in anything that we heard from that public comment that might be appropriate to place in one of these bills or in another bill. So with that, Brian, I guess that I think we'll go with public comment. And I did because Liz was a presenter, I knew she also had comment on the bill drafts as well. So I thought it was more appropriate to let her do that in a public comment form. So I'm going to start with Liz, and then we'll roll down the list of people that we have for public comment. So Ms. Zerga, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. With respect to the bills, the one I am looking at is the Broadband Development Bill. And these aren't comments for critique of language or anything like that. They're ideas with respect to the bill. I don't have language for them. And at a later date, I'll provide more definitive comments to be worked when the bill is worked. But with respect to this first bill, generally speaking, we like this concept. The carriers in my organization like this concept. There are two aspects that you may want to think about, and that is with respect.
Sharon, can I interrupt for one moment? Ms. Zerga, would you give at least the number of the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Please go ahead.
Yes, Senator Von Flatern, it's 20 LSO 0731, working draft .6, titled Broadband Development.
And just in general, for the public listening that haven't pulled up the bills, and we'll go through the bills and we'll have staff explain all the bills, but I would rather hear some public comment beforehand, because I just think it's easier for us to hear ideas if there's ideas. So that is a broadband grant program, that bill. Please, Liz, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the things that you might look at in this bill is I do not believe that there is any kind of a preference stated for the kinds of technology you're looking for, other than the part that talks about 5G. You might want to look at that further. I know some of you who have worked in this area definitely have a preference with respect to, it's not a preference necessarily, but there are certain technologies that due to latency or otherwise that you might not want to fund with this bill. Then the other comment that I would make is with respect to 5G.
Liz?
Yeah.
So Liz, I may ask some questions as you go along, and
Sure.
and we'll get into that on this bill. But I do think that bill said terrestrial, so I'm kind of wondering, maybe we weren't explicit on that, but is that the sort of thing that you're talking about? Could be satellite versus terrestrial versus the myriad of things that could exist out there. Is that kind of what you're talking about there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the bill defines the areas that are not served with reference to terrestrial, but in terms of the kinds of projects that you will fund, it does not specify any kind of technology. So it could be any kind of technology with respect to the funded aspects. And so you might want to revisit that. And then with respect to the one kind of technology that is mentioned, 5G technology, just for the benefit of everybody on the task force, 5G comes in many flavors, and some things that are called 5G technology are not 5G. And there isn't a definition of 5G, so you might want to revisit that. The only other comment that I'm going to make today with respect to the bill, and again, we are generally supportive of this bill, there is a process where the council receives the application and then is to approve it in 7 days after receipt. I would recommend that you put in there something to the effect of that there will be a notice to existing carriers. There's already a process at the Wyoming Business Council for notice and some opportunity for carriers to respond if they think there's been a mistake made in the application. In other words, the application for grants is based on an assumption that the area is either unserved or has certain categories of speeds. And so that is the only other comment I'm going to make about that bill, but we are generally supportive of that. Oh, there is one other. This bill is funded with CARES Act dollars, and I too have been following the Treasury guidance pretty carefully with respect to whether or not funding can be used for broadband deployment. Obviously, my carriers are quite interested in being able to access money to be able to deploy broadband further. And we would ask that you would address in the bill a way that payment would be made so there is not risk that the carrier starts down the path of building this and then the CARES dollars get stopped or pulled back, and the risk is then with the carrier who has started the project, put in the application, got the the award, but they have started the project and then the funding is pulled back after they bought the fiber, got the permits, started plowing.
Okay, Senator Von Flattern.
Isn't it, Ms. Zerga, and thank you, Ms. Chairman. Ms. Zerga, isn't it true that you have to have an invoice for work done to be covered by the CARES Act?
Mr. Chairman's
Liz, please.
Senator Von Flatter. So the way the CARES Act guidance that I read said was that you cannot prepay for items if that is not the normal practice of the entity. In other words, if the entity does prepay for some things, you can do that. And so the question here is, how can that be structured in a way so that the broadband provider who tries to accomplish these projects and gets them done is not at risk? And just a way to look at that. I don't have an idea about what that would look like, but I know as my carriers are looking at this and thinking, should we put in an application? Can we get it done? Crews are already out there, time is short. You know, what can we do? So I would ask that you look at that, because it makes a big difference in whether you're going to get carriers jumping in to try to get these grants to get something done in a quality way to provide broadband.
Fair enough. Ms. Zerga, is there anything else on that bill?
No, Mr. Chairman, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Please continue.
Mr. Chairman, the next draft is working draft 20 LSO 0737.4 state broadband support. With respect to section 1 of the bill, this is the portion of the bill that would take and put rural healthcare clinics, hospitals, other medical providers on ETS and create what's titled wireless access points at community development centers. As you might imagine, my carriers think there should be a different alternative to that. And one of the alternatives to that is considering for those entities that do not have fiber, the ones that are listed, and I think a number of them do, but not all of them do. For those that don't have fiber, that you have a funding program to get fiber to those folks and look at funding an SD-WAN kind of arrangement for those folks. So that could be set up fairly quickly for those that are already fibered. In any event, even with this provision in here, you know, there are going to be the one that is in here currently with ETS, that would require fiber to be paid for by the state to get to ETS. And many of those entities already have fiber on the carrier's network. And so it would be a duplication of fiber in some instances, depending on where the aggregation points are for those. So it's a duplication of fiber over top of the carrier. And it's unclear to us, based on the bill, what services would be allowable via ETS. It could be an intranet, which is what the school districts have. It could be access to the internet. It could be other kinds of enhanced services. So carriers provide all of those as solutions. And so we think that an alternative to what you have in the bill for section 1 would be having the state pay for fiber to the premises of these places that don't have it, which is a small subset compared to the amount that you're going to have to put fiber to overbuild the carriers. And that you look at funding an SD-WAN type of solution. I think what we need to do though first is, and I've requested this, have a conversation with the hospital association and the medical providers to see what it is they actually want. Those that we talk.
So Ms. Zerga,
Yes.
so just a comment on this. So I sat in, as you know, I came in on a broadband advisory council meeting in Afton a year ago. And it was a little over, I don't know, right about this time. And there was like one member of telehealth, a telehealth guy there from a certain institution, and several telecom, and really it was, I felt like he was being read the riot act for wanting to be on the unified network. And so that was decided at the end, we're going to find solutions, right? We're going to try to find what the solutions are to get this done, to get something done, right? Something better than we have now. And it's been a year. It's just, and I have not seen any proposals from Telecom back. Maybe that's existed, but I certainly have not seen anything put forth by you guys. It's not like you don't know this issue has existed, because it's existed for a while. And so I'm at least glad to see that I don't know what SD-WAN is. Somebody's going to have to explain that to me. I don't really know even what that is, but I feel like there's been an opportunity for you folks to come to the table and proactively solve this issue. And I haven't seen it. So I'm wondering, I guess I'm just going to throw that at you, and then you can throw it back at me. Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, there was one individual who did come from one hospital and talked about wanting to get on the unified network. And what has been done since then, since that point, is I asked my carrier who can provide service to that hospital to reach out to that hospital and ask them what it is they need and what they want. That carrier has reached out repeatedly. And I don't know if the circumstances of that hospital have changed. I understand they may have, and that they may be able to access a network that belongs to a bigger hospital group that they're working with, but we have been unsuccessful in getting that hospital to communicate with us about what it is they were trying to solve for themselves. We have talked to some other hospitals, and they've indicated that they are satisfied with what they have and they aren't asking for a solution. So, Mr. Chairman, when the task force indicated that they were looking at this, we certainly have been thinking about this. We haven't found a hospital group yet that wants it from us. I am aware of that one hospital that did talk about this, but again, we've reached out to them through the carriers asking if we could sit down with them to ask them about what they need to see if we can provide a solution. And we have been unsuccessful in getting that commentary back. So we have solutions that would work for these hospitals and clinics. We need to know what their needs are. How many of them have fiber? That's what we need.
And I guess just a follow up on that. So at what cost? I mean, I think there's also been a discussion with the telehealth network. I think you're aware of, and I think that was part of this, as well as with that hospital. It was with that network group. And Ms. Hardesty may know more about this than me, but I still think this is, I don't know if there's still a real need or not, and I don't know what the costs are associated. Maybe it's these hospitals are seeing their costs escalate, that the solutions are too expensive. And so I guess that's the other question back to you all is, are there affordable solutions? I mean, you can get dedicated fiber to any place in the state of Wyoming if you're willing to pay enough money. The question is, how much is that going to add to healthcare? How much is our hospitals and clinics able and willing to pay that? And then whether, do we want as a state want to provide something, provide some of that? I don't know. But those are also questions I have is on cost. But I won't belabor this, but you can please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your comments about cost. I know you have a provider on the committee who's familiar with SD-WAN, and I'm not going to try to be, she's familiar with operations and far more familiar with it than I am. I do know that other hospitals have chosen SD-WAN alternatives for this kind of a solution for networking. So I really do think that is a solution that is an alternative. It lifts all boats. It lifts the providers that provide the services, and it provide solutions for medical providers and hospitals. With respect to the rest of the bill, the only other comment that I would make, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you to the person or people who contributed to the second and third part of this bill, because those are aspects that are designed to be able to allow us to get into right-of-way or to get access to pieces of right-of-way where it's more difficult. And the one comment that was made that I would make with respect to these road projects, where YDOT would put in conduit, there are several instances that you need to be aware of where, because of past history, YDOT would not let us put conduit in a right-of-way. And so we put conduit in paralleling the right-of-way. And I don't think that in those instances, you want to or need to have YDOT install conduit. It's not in the road right-of-way, but because of past history, YDOT required us to put it out of the right-of-way, and we got our own private right-of-way. And I know some of you might say, well, is that conduit available to anybody else, or those kinds of things? And what I would say in response is my carriers are in the business of leasing fiber, selling fiber, and providing services to other carriers, just as they do when they're in the highway right-of-way. So you might want to look at language along the lines of installing that conduit where there's no conduit in the road, or paralleling the road pathway so that you don't have duplications. The only other comment I would make about that is that if, in spite of our opposition to it, you decide that you want to work on the ETS aspect, there are a lot of things that are not defined in there about what services, what access points, what it would be that you were providing on the state's dime, what the participants would have to pay for out of their own dime. That's all not very defined. And obviously, with definition, that could change how the people who would be the recipients of that might view it. And so I think there's a fair amount of work that needs to be done on that aspect, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Liz. Any questions from anybody on the committee for Liz right now? Speaker Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Liz, thanks for your work today and your help. Just question really going back to the director earlier today when he was, I think Chairman was really asking, what are two things, and one was this easement, perfecting the right of ways. And, and you think about that where we have a regulated utility, electricity, or cooperatives. And then we have all these pipelines, too, that have all these easements already. And obviously that's, that would take a little political muscle, be a pretty big push, but other states have done it and, gotten way out in front of us. There's still a reason we keep saying we're getting there and we're getting there, but we're still one of the worst in the country. And at some point we got to say, okay, uncle, we're going to moonshot and jump to like top 10. And so when I heard this morning, like 10 years, we ain't got 10 years. I think the Senator Dockstader said the same thing. What can we do to make it 5 years? And so anyway, my question is just about easements and about that issue. That was one of two things brought up by the director he thought could really make a big difference. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts on that with respect to easements, easements are a tough issue for us in some aspects. And that is when we're dealing with the federal government. They slow us down immensely. YDOT is good to work with. So where you have state highways, we have easements. counties are pretty good to work with. It's a little slower in some counties. So where you have county roadway, we have good access to easements there. That hits a lot of your population between the highways and the county road easements. With respect to the federal aspect, though, boy, that slows us down. And I would applaud anything that can get us through federal delay. It takes us 2 to 3 years sometimes to get our permitting from those folks. And we would have more fiber in the ground today were it not for delays in permitting through federal. And so if there is something WYDOT can do, the state can do to get us through those federal areas faster, that would help immensely. On the issue of the electric and those kinds of easements, for the most part, as you might imagine, the rural carriers where their traditional area, they have easements pretty much everywhere like the rural cooperatives do. It's not such a big issue there. It's when they step outside and try to serve some of these other areas. And I know there was a bill in Colorado. I think some of the carriers that I work with are familiar with it. If I recall correctly, that bill was set up so that the rural electric cooperatives could be a provider over their own facilities for that. And in Wyoming, that issue has been explored and kicked around. There was one rural cooperative down in the southeast part of Wyoming that looked at that. And after they looked at where there was already facilities and service and so on, and part of that was in our area, they decided it was not worthwhile for them. Maybe it would help in some of these areas. So I certainly think that that's something that can be looked at. And I think there was language that everybody thought was fine and was agreeable, but I don't want to say that that is going to be the end all be all solution for everything, because I'm not sure how many rural electric cooperatives want to get in the business of being a communications provider.
Well,
So-
I guess my thoughts, and I don't know enough about it, but my thoughts were really, to use that easement. And so that becomes available to the providers,
Oh, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I see you're talking about opening those electric easements to anybody to put communications facilities through there. That would help. Boy, that is a big battle and big lift for some rural folk. But yeah, that would,
It's
I
gotta be
think that
some
would,
kind of compensation, obviously, but we could work that out, whether it's service or, but geez, there's telephone poles running to every farmhouse and every town. So, okay, I guess I'll ask you the same thing then that Chairman Summers was asking. What are the two big things we can do? Like right now?
Mr. Chairman, right now, give us some money. Give us, I'll tell you, we are struggling with workforce to be able to complete the projects. If you said right now, we have contracts, obviously, that we entered into quite some time ago to get projects out. Everybody is building because of ACAM, that money that I talked about. And we're having delays and we're having increases in costs. Everything is quite expensive right now. So we're competing with each other amongst ourselves to get workforce and crews to come in to help lay fiber. But money is one, and certainly you're addressing that. And number two is get us permits right away. Get us permits and right away as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Mr. Speaker. And Liz, there's one more bill, I believe, and it was our attempt to put into bill your idea.
Mr. Chairman, we like it. We like it. The only thing that you might revisit is whether the dollar amount is enough for these folks. You might consider bumping that up. But we like that bill. We like how you structured it. It's great.
Liz, just quickly, we put, we started out with 50, decided that was too much money. I forget, $1 million, you 20, you can do the math. And so what is an optimal amount? We thought we didn't want to do it all, right? So what would a typical service to one of those homes cost? We thought maybe we could supplement that, but not take away, not completely do what you're doing. So what would a typical service cost?
Mr. Chairman, so it varies obviously among provider, and when you say cost, I'm assuming you're meaning what is that price? What is the price that the person would pay? And it varies among my providers. I've seen prices that range from, and this is for the 30, typically they offer a service that's around 30 down, 10 up. Nobody does 25, 3 that I saw. Maybe there is somebody out there, not all the services are up on the web, but just in a brief review through the web of my YTA carriers, most of them, they seem to have a package around 30 down, 10 up. And those packages at the low end are around $42 for some providers. And depending on where you are and how rural you are, they can be upwards of $80 for that. So that, as you're trying to set an amount that a person would be able to afford those services when they've lost their jobs, I just think maybe a little higher might be appropriate.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask Ms. Zerga any questions? Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Liz, thank you for the presentation. Well, the public comment. In the first bill, 731, you mentioned about the technology of specifying 5G and why we might not want to think about that. As far as I know, I think there are situations where 5G may actually be worse, especially in low frequency bands, where the range isn't as far as 4G, even though the benefit and speed is slightly higher. Do you know about this, and can you comment on it? And the situation with establishing new cell towers that use satellite as the backhaul ends up having increased latency issues, especially in the rural areas. So my question to you would be, would it make more sense for the cellular network portions of the bill to maybe specify speed and latency requirements instead of a specific technology for the cellular networks?
Liz?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yin, exactly. Yes.
Senator Dockstader, please.
And as before we leave this, then Liz, you say we have to have 5G specifically defined in statute. We're missing that now.
Liz.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dockstader, it just says 5G technology and it's not well defined. If I were defining what it is that you want, I would define it by a minimum speed and a latency. You could say 5G. You could say 5G technology that has a minimum speed and a latency, but do be careful, because if you specify too high of a speed, you may not get the distance that you want. So there is a sweet spot. And I'm confident you have the technology people within your group to be able to address that, but I do think it's something you should address.
And just to, to let everybody else know the thought there, we knew that there were many flavors of 5G. 5G is, it's like the golden ring that you want to grab, but nobody's grabbed it and nobody has because nobody's defined it. So we think we understand that. And I think what we really were trying to do is just that. What can we do to enhance a few communities in Wyoming, maybe, to try to to try to do something more than most others have done. And so to me, the speed is, it is speed. And if that requires more, obviously that requires more antennas. You can call them what you want to, but they're antennas. Then so be it. But I think the idea was, can we enhance a community in Wyoming simply as a showcase, if nothing else, to show we can do it? And what that is, I think, is debatable. And I think that's certainly why we have you folks and others around is, what can we do? What is the potential? And how do we move that forward? So that it is really a placeholder, and we simply put that in there as a placeholder. So any other questions of Liz from this group? If not, we thank you very much for being on here and providing us comment and sticking with the process, and to let other people out in the audience, in the broader audience, know why Liz is here is because Liz is persistent, and from the moment this broadband task force was created, she kept calling to see, how can we participate? And so I made sure she could. It was no intent on slighting anybody else out there. Any other provider will provide plenty of opportunity for everybody to comment before the end of the next meeting. So, and I hope everybody will. I hope all people that have an interest in this, whether it's industry, whether it's the end user, whether it's telehealth people, I hope they will provide us plenty of comments. So Liz, thank you. And Brian, who's our next? Looks like I see Cindy Delancey's got her name up. Is that my next person? There she is. All right, Cindy, welcome. Please tell us who you are, what you represent. And I think you're muted, so you're going to have to demute, and I'll let you go now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name's Cindy Delancey, and I'm the president of the Wyoming Business Alliance. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today. It's really been a fascinating conversation. Many of you know that the Wyoming Business Alliance has been hard at work on these issues for many years. I'm very pleased to remind the committee that really the genesis of Senate File 100 that established the Broadband Advisory Council as well as the Broadband Manager really was an outgrowth of some of the work of the Technology Committee at the Wyoming Business Alliance. And what we did was we queried other states. We got on the phone as a group with the Broadband Manager in Colorado. We got on the phone with the Broadband Manager in Utah. And we really started talking to these individuals to ask the same questions that you are all asking now. What works? What can we do? How can we expedite increasing our capacity? And it was really fascinating, for us to learn that most Western states are really in the same boat. We're all struggling with this tremendous expense. The providers in Wyoming, in my opinion, have done a wonderful job stepping up and trying to make investments in our state to increase our capacity. And we still clearly have a long way to go, but Wyoming is business ready and becoming more and more so each time. So I wanted to share with you quickly, I know you still have more material ahead. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I handed out a matrix, and maybe before I do that, I'll just set the stage a little bit more of this document. But when you all engaged in your management council discussions prior to the special session and the establishment of this task force came up, the discussion really focused around creating a task force that was going to be centered around 5 main themes: telehealth, telecommuting, teleeducation, building and delivering last mile service, and internet access to low income citizens. So our committee, who's made up of AARP, the Medical Society, as well as our providers, Mr. Kudra has joined us oftentimes. I highlight that because it's a very diverse group. Kristen Lee is one of our co-chairs, and Sam Shumway with AARP is our other co-chairs. So it's not that we've assembled a team that is all like-minded, kind of looking down the same pathway together. we've specifically encouraged WBA members to come on this committee to have that diversity in thought and perspective. And we assembled with the hope of maybe providing somewhat of a tool or a roadmap to all of you as you continue on in your discussion, specifically surrounding good resource use of the COVID-19 dollars that have been allocated for Wyoming. Some ideas related to all 5 of those buckets, if you will. And this document, we call it the matrix, has been blessed by our committee. Everyone agrees with the bullet points that could be ripe for discussion or review as far as when we get to resource allocation on some of the needs in each one of these 5 categories. So again, I don't want to go through each one screen by screen, but I would like to, I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen here. Maybe LSO might be able to help me somehow, but
Cindy, I am of no help.
okay, no, I get it.
Mr. Chairman, there's a green button that says share screen at the bottom of the Zoom page.
Yeah, I've got that, Brian. I just am trying to locate the document that I'd like to share. I've got that up on my computer. I just don't know how to get it so you all can see it. So with that.
So Cindy, just so you know, we have been emailed that document.
Okay.
You know, if you want to hit
Sure.
some highlights on that, that might be as good as anything. And particularly, I think in the end, you know, if you've got 2 or 3, 1, 2, 3 main ideas how we can really move things forward, that would be best. But we do now have your document.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will practice my screen sharing a little bit better for next time. Thank you for your indulgence and patience with that. So, you know, in addition to everything that's already been stated by Mr. Kudra and Ms. Zerga, you know, this regulatory barrier, working on federal lands, we experience that in the oil and gas industry all the time. You know, 15 years to get a completed EIS. Unfortunately, our telecom providers are experiencing the same type of federal delay, which if somebody can figure out a solution to that challenge, that would be wonderful. But putting that aside, we put a little bit of a different spin on, you know, some of the discussions that have been had today around telehealth and connectivity amongst the clinics. Really what it sounds to me like, and again, as someone that's been observing these conversations for many, many years now, I offer up to you and to this committee to use my committee maybe as a conduit or a tool or a resource for this committee to be a convener. Because it seems to me that at times communication, when you get all the parties together and sit down and figure out what it really is that we're wanting, that we're trying to solve for, can save an awful lot of time and help move the ball forward. So I have some takeaways just from listening to the discussion today amongst my members that are hospitals and providers, and I'm happy to try to do some work on that. But with telehealth, we thought that in addition to the issues that have already been stated, trying to look at some connectivity to help with visitation in our nursing homes and senior centers. You know, if there's one silver lining of this COVID crisis, is that it's really forced us all to embrace technology in a way that maybe we haven't done so. You know, look at the meeting that we're holding today. This feels all very natural for us after the dozens of hours that we've all spent Zooming together. You know, 6 months ago, this would have been unheard of. So really thinking about ways to try to open up access to help our senior population feel a little bit more connected with loved ones, especially during the time that maybe that visitation was limited in person. But as we continue to have safety risks, we can utilize technology to try to mitigate those risks. Related to telecommuting, in our view, Wyoming really can be the telecommuting capital of the world. And you know, we kind of broke it down into state as well as private sector and governmental needs for us to maybe take a look at. You know, modernizing state A&I policy to allow for government workers to work from home. You know, those are a little bit more policy as opposed to technology needs, but you know, giving a refresh of maybe some of those policies that could help more of our workers might be a cost saver as well. and looking at a way to see if there would be electronic means for the state to access online payments to help some of our workers work from home that take money or process payments, having somewhat of a mainframe to be able to take those types of payments online so people could work at home might be a way to open some additional doors there. You know, and again, it's also a way to, if we invest in our telecommuting capacity, to kind of help that economic development piece that we also desperately want for Wyoming by being able to attract more gig or economy specific type workers. We've talked a lot about teleeducation today. You know, we really feel, you know, I have the privilege of serving with Senator Wasserberger on the Education Attainment Council. And as we continue to look at ways to try to get people back to school and offer educational opportunities online, this is truly a place that we can continue to grow and advance. Maybe by looking at some of the work that Google's doing by putting internet on school buses. So when our children do go back to school, that they're able to use their time on the bus while they're commuting to be doing their homework in a virtual environment, and having some of those pieces of homework done before they get home. Maybe also getting some funds to help with training for parents and students to utilize online software. Having gone through, you know, with 2 children in my household this past few months of online schooling, again, I feel like my technology capacity has grown immensely, just trying to make sure that they're up to date on their assignments and that their grades, I was able to check in on that. But I get the sense talking to a lot of my friends that, you know, there's a need for parents to be able to have that ability to learn as well. You know, again, just going through the potential of utilizing maybe the UW extension offices to be able to be hotspots in rural communities, we thought might be a great way to look at some feasibility of having the extension folks work with populations on helping expand all of our knowledge on technology. Delivering the last mile services was our next category. We talked through a lot of those topics. One thing that came up within our group that might be a little out there was maybe taking a look at the Article 16.6 language in the Constitution and, you know, really trying to eliminate a barrier to public-private partnerships. You know, that it seems that 16.6 language comes up often as something that everyone is very, very sensitive and mindful of. But as we continue to try to look at ways to work together, you know, maybe taking a look at doing some legal research around that, or having a policy conversation around that, you know, maybe might be something worth considering going forward. Evaluating federal grant availability in comparison of state funding options to determine which is best for Wyoming. I recall Ms. Zerga speaking about how if we as a state allocate money that could potentially jeopardize federal funding. So making sure that there's a mechanism to figure out what might be the best route for Wyoming to take could certainly be part of that building and delivering last mile analysis. And then finally, internet access to low-income citizens was the last category that this committee was thinking about taking a deeper look at. Digital inclusion, Mr. Kudra spoke about that earlier as well today. Apparently the state of Maine has done an incredible job of taking the lead on trying to develop some programs to make sure that we have internet access to populations of our communities that might not be able to have. I know our providers in Wyoming, especially during the pandemic, have done everything they can to try to help people be on their computer. Wider distribution of the Lifeline program, including education and aid of the application process, how to get those funds. Funds are based on income and spending funds. This I think is a really important piece. Allocating some of the funds if possible on public outreach to help get the message out about what options are available for low income or populations who otherwise might not be able to access the internet was one of the key components that the group felt was very important as well. But again, we assembled together, just coalesced our ideas. I thought it would be helpful to share these ideas with you as you're looking for ways to deploy these resources during these very, very challenging times. And just really wanted to thank you for your work. And please know that you have a whole army of subject matter experts, as well as some other, perspectives waiting in the wings to be of assistance to you in any way that we possibly can. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, I just want to deeply express my appreciation for the ability to appear with you over Zoom and to be able to use the technology that we have today. And thank you to the LSO staff too. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Does anybody have any questions of Ms. Delancey? Not, thank you for your time. And I guess next up, Brian, who do we have next?
Mr. Chairman, Director Schmidt of the Department of Family Services should be joining us momentarily.
Okay. Director Schmidt, I see your name now, so we're getting closer. There you are. Perfect.
Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Hi, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Corin Schmidt, and I'm the Director of the Department of Family Services, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on a topic that I'm quite honestly not very familiar with. So the lead-in conversation by Ms. Delancey certainly was helpful for setting some of the context for what I expect is the thinking behind House Bill Draft 0745.2. And I certainly respect and admire the intent of this legislation. We're always going to advocate for ways to provide services to low-income people and to kind of extend the conversation that Ms. Delancey started about the reliance on broadband. Certainly from an agency perspective, as we had to deploy all of our caseworkers to their homes, they relied heavily on broadband from their residential setting to be able to access the necessary systems in order to do child protective services. Even more importantly, though, is that about 30% of our visits were done via televideo or via video. So we had expanded our capacity to do visitation via video, both at the boys' school, the girls' school, and with families, with multidisciplinary teams around court activities, et cetera. So certainly the conversation we learned firsthand through the COVID experience that broadband is just an incredible part of our infrastructure. A few comments maybe in general about the proposed legislation. We currently do not have a program available that we could slide this into. So we have a variety of things that we do around eligibility and program management, but there isn't one that would fit this. So to stand this up would be the creation of a whole new program. We have some things in place that we could use some of our systems, but they would all require some sort of modification to do the case management based on what I'm seeing in terms of eligibility and criteria. Another place where we're a little short on standing this program up would be in our relationship with the telecommunication industry. We are not familiar with those folks. That's not somebody we interact with right now. Certainly we engage with power companies, we engage with a lot of private industry, but telecommunications just isn't a relationship that we have already established. So we would have to work to establish that in order to ensure that we were making the right contact with telecommunications company to set this up so that we could get the necessary agreements in place in order to make this work. We have some slight changes to make recommendations, but I think when you work the bill, or if you want to hear those now, that's fine. But I think the important thing is just for the committee to understand that there is no infrastructure right now within the Department of Family Services that this would easily slide into. We would have to create it. And depending on lead time based on where this bill goes and through the special session, it may minimize our ability to deploy it quickly. Something else to consider is looking backward, especially around the school-based criteria, where part of when a family applies, it would be based on the premise that a child needed access to broadband internet services in order to complete educational activities. Right now we're in summer, so it doesn't apply, but looking back, it maybe could have applied. And then certainly looking forward, depending on the number of schools that choose not to open as a result of COVID, then would also affect the criteria. So, Mr. Chairman, and this was a quick review today of this legislation with, some pinging impact from all of our staff. So we don't have a real coherent message for you quite yet. Looking forward to the June conversation, but certainly those are some of the issues that we recognized.
Thank you, and I do appreciate that. And yeah, I'm sure that it looks a bit daunting, but I think, we created a renter program that probably also looked a little daunting that went through the last special session. So yeah, I'm not, we don't know where we're at on this. This was just an idea that was brought to us, and we thought we would try to create what, a facility, just try to create that and see what it might look like and try to get comment like this. So we do appreciate your comment, and if we move forward, we hope you will provide extensive comment on what you might need to implement this. Does anybody have any questions of Director Schmidt? Nope. All right, thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Next up, Brian.
Mr. Chairman, we should have Aaron Socko in the room.
All right, Aaron, we're starting to see you there. There we go. I think you're on.
Excellent. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all members of the task force. Again, my name is Aaron Socko, and I'm the Vice President and General Manager of Advanced Communications Technology, or ACT, based here in Sheridan, Wyoming. Over the years, ACT has constructed a robust and redundant fiber-based network that extends throughout many areas of the state and provides services to many businesses and several locations throughout the state, including multiple hospitals and medical clinics. ACT also supplies fiber connections to a number of other carriers throughout the state. I'm here just to address you briefly on the proposed use of the state's unified network to provide connectivity and potentially broadband and other services to hospitals and healthcare providers. My company is in the business of providing broadband services and connectivity to hospitals and healthcare providers. And while I certainly appreciate the desire for an immediate, affordable, and efficient solution for networking these healthcare facilities, I would encourage that before we turn to the state for a solution, some additional discussion with all the private communications providers throughout the state be invited to the table to discuss options with these healthcare providers. While I cannot speak to all communications companies in the state, I do believe many of their stories are similar to ours, as well as our parent company, Range Telephone. Over the past several years, ACT and our parent company have invested tens of millions of dollars in building a state-of-the-art, very large capacity fiber optic network that extends throughout a large portion of Wyoming. Many cities and towns in Wyoming are now accessible from that network, including Casper, including Gillette, Sheridan, Cheyenne, and several other cities and towns in the state. We've invested millions of additional dollars to construct fiber directly to the hospitals and healthcare clinics in not only our exchanges, but in exchanges in other areas, even served by CenturyLink. With this state-of-the-art high-speed fiber network, we are capable of providing any level of connectivity necessary to satisfy the needs of even the most bandwidth-intensive telehealth services. In addition, our communications experts are well-versed in many of the latest technologies being used for small and large businesses today, including specialized solutions offering secure, HIPAA-compliant services capable of connecting multiple healthcare facilities to a scalable, affordable, and easily managed architecture, much like Ms. Sessions and others have discussed today. To date, we've not been afforded the opportunity to join a discussion with our state's hospitals and healthcare providers to better understand just exactly what it is that they are trying to accomplish. We have not had the opportunity to provide our thoughts, our pricing, our expertise in their search for a solution. It seems, just listening to the conversation and over the last several months as we've worked through this, that a lot of assumptions are being made that private solutions that a private solution is not there or would be cost prohibitive or even unworkable. From ACT's perspective, that is not the case. I truly believe if given the chance, our state's private communications providers can present a real solution that would meet all the needs of even the largest of our hospitals, and at the same time lift the economies of all businesses, communications providers included. Turning to the state government to be the solution without reaching out to ACT and other similar carriers who have already made and are making the investments to be the solution for this type of scenario is very discouraging for future investments in the state. I am here today just to simply ask for the opportunity to be at the table along with other communications providers, as well as all the healthcare professionals, in an effort to find a solution that is right for everyone, including what is right for the future economy of Wyoming. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. I just appreciate the opportunity.
I really appreciate you coming before us and testifying, and thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions of Mr. Sapalko? Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sapalko, thanks for coming before us today. I wasn't really here when the original Broadband Advisory Council was formed. So I think my question to you, especially given that Mr. Chairman has asked this before, is that this conversation has started a while ago. And so what were you not brought to the table earlier? And if you were, what were the solutions presented before that didn't end up working out?
Mr. Chair.
Please go ahead.
Representative Yin. We actually have had a couple of conversations. In fact, I don't recall the exact timeline, but here most recently, a fairly generic request for proposals was floated, to which we did provide a solution, and that it actually included most carriers throughout the state, all the independents as well as even CenturyLink. I don't know where the responses to that went. I do know that that was submitted by a number of, by us as well as a number of the carriers that we work with, and no further discussion was had on that. In addition to that RFP, we did reach out with questions regarding the telehealth network, and the use of telehealth has been, generically applied on many occasions, and so we're trying to figure out exactly what they're looking for. Are they looking for a solution where they can do? Is it simply record sharing, or is it a review of X-rays or checkups, etc.? As Ms. Sessions has discussed previously during this conversation today, there are options out there that can be more affordable, such as software-defined wide area network, or SD-WAN. That's basically, just to simplify it, use of the cloud for these purposes. And so what we're trying to do, and ultimately why we want to come to the table, is so that we have the opportunity to better understand what those healthcare providers are looking for exactly, so that we may be able to provide a solution. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Hopefully it did.
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank you for coming on, and I appreciate your time. And with that, we will move on to the next commenter, and that looks like it's Jack Walkenhorst. Jack, are you there?
I am here, Representative Chairman.
Hi, Jack. Well, welcome. And it's your time to comment.
All right. I appreciate that. Just echoing a little bit from a provider standpoint, some of the things that Mr. Sapko mentioned, as far as some of the providers and
Jack,
what we've done within the state.
Just for the sake of everybody else, maybe tell everybody kind of who you are, who you represent. I know you, but others don't.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I get in front of this and I forget some of the things I'm thinking. I represent All West Communications. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships for All West. And we provide service in the southwest part of the state, mainly Evanston, Kemmer, Rock Springs, Green River, and then also Cokeville. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Mr. Chair, as to who we are and the areas in which we serve.
Thank you, Jack. Please continue.
Okay. Just a couple of things I wanted to bring up. First, talking just about the unified network and healthcare facilities. We are currently building into a facility in the community of Evanston, one that we were reached out to with an RFP and awarded that RFP. And it's something that, you know, the bill costs are significant. We are covering that as a company, and just hate to see something like that pulled out from under us. If they were to go onto the unified network or something like that, Representative. Couple of other things just really quick. Need to turn down my volume just a little bit. Things that were talked about in regards to YDOT and others that have reached out to other states, Utah in particular, to see how they were doing some things. We do business in Utah as well. All West does, and we work very closely with the Department of Transportation there, with their fiber director that was mentioned, and we've had fiber and duct sharing agreements with them for about 12 to 13 years. And so just something there to keep in mind as Wyoming thinks about some different things and ways of doing it. And we are certainly open to those discussions and looking at how we can be a part of those and help with those as well. Another just couple of things, Mr. Chair, a couple of things that you asked. One question was internet or broadband speeds and up to speed, and if those speeds change when things get more congested or more users are on the network. That is something that we as a company check and keep track of very closely. And when a customer subscribes to a certain speed, that is the speed that they get or more than that. In most situations, there are a few situations where that can be affected by the transport, and we look at those very closely. Just one other thing as well. We talked about some federal programs, and RDOF being one of them. And that is something that we as a company look at, as well as many others. And as we talk about federal programs or how the state can help, many of those programs, they don't pay, they don't cover all of the costs of builds and moving into an unserved or underserved area. But that little bit of support or help can put you over the top and say, yes, I can do that with that little bit of support, as well as much more support and much more investment that comes from a company. So just a few things to consider and a few thoughts from us. Appreciate the task force, the time that you spend, what you're trying to do in the state of Wyoming. And please know that we as a company, and I'm sure other carriers as well, we are heavily invested in the state. We want to be in the state, and we want to do business in the state. And when we look at projects, when we look at things that we want to do, yes, we're looking at it with an ROI, but even more so, we're looking at it with the question of how can we help and provide these services to those that don't have them now, and how can we provide the best services possible to residents and businesses within the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Any questions for Jack? Not, well, thank you, and I'll go to the next one.
Thank you.
Jason Hendricks, you're up.
Hello, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Yeah, my name is Jason Hendricks. I'm the Chief Government Relations Officer for the Range companies. So that includes Range, RT Communications, Du Bois Telephone Exchange, and ACT. Aaron Sopko just spoke on behalf of ACT. Had this been, a normal committee meeting, we probably would have gone up to the table together, and I would have gone first, and then wanted to have him speak on Unified Network, but that's okay. I'll just try to make sure I don't touch on some of the stuff that he did. And then same thing with Ms. Zerger. I'll try not to, in the interest of time, repeat the stuff that she said, or even Ms. Delancey, because I serve on the task force, or the committee, the technology committee that came up with some of the positions there. So our companies, we provide broadband throughout the state. If you still have access to the map that Ms. Zerga provided, you can see our companies, but primarily Range Telephone Cooperative is in the northeast part of the state. RT Communications would be in the northeast, central, and southeast. Du Bois Telephone Exchange would be Du Bois and Bags. And then ACT would be Sheridan, and then all of the communities that we've reached out to for competitive services. So just some stats on our companies. According to FCC data, we have about 1.16 customer locations per square mile, so very rural. We have 12,500 broadband customers in over 30 communities, 4,700 miles of fiber in the state, 100 or so employees in the state. And again, this is collectively between the four companies. We've done fiber to the premise in a lot of the communities. Worland, Thermopolis, Sundance, Pine Bluffs, Newcastle, Du Bois, and we'll continue to do so. But we're also reaching out into the more rural areas. So areas outside of the towns are getting fiber to the premise as well. We take federal money and we serve areas under that federal program, again, ACAM, for areas that don't have 25.3. Through that program and then additional investments, we'll be investing more than $150 million in fiber over the next 10 years. And when we invest in the areas, we don't just take it up to the 25.3. Our typical build will be a fiber to the home build. So that's gigabit capability, even in the most rural areas. And we are, when the new Unified Network contract becomes effective, we'll be the provider of the majority of the backbone circuits on the Unified Network through ACT. So the bottom line is we're very committed to expanding broadband in Wyoming, and we'll continue to do so. Ms. Zerga referenced the FCC pledge that all of the WYTA companies signed, along with a lot of companies throughout the country, to not terminate services to customers during COVID who can't pay their bills, to waive late fees, to open Wi-Fi hotspots, and then going beyond the pledge, what a lot of companies did. We provided free and discounted connections to 270 students and educators through the end of the school year, actually up until June 12th. So we did go beyond that. So that's the background of who we are, what we're doing in the state. As far as general positions going forward on some of the issues you guys are considering, mapping, just wanted to let you know, we will be submitting shape files showing our areas. And again, that's basically just polygons around areas that we serve. It's just much more finely tuned than what the FCC did with the census block data. So you can do polygons, you can do dots, and you can do lines. And that shows much more accurately where service is provided. And just for reference, we did talk about that with the, at that time, the new broadband manager, shortly after the Broadband Advisory Council's formed. So back in 2018, we did propose a shapefile type approach as an alternative to going with the FCC 477 census block data. From a timing perspective, everyone agreed to just go with a more current version of the 477 data than even the FCC had. But that we would shift to a shapefile as soon as possible, to the extent everyone was willing to do it. And unfortunately, that there was a delay, but we always had a willingness to do that, and we will be providing that data. And with that data, it'll be the problem areas in the state, the areas without broadband, will be more easily identified. And I think, in general, for all this stuff, let's identify the problems and then we can come up with a better solution. I think sometimes there are solutions that get ahead of the problems. Specifically, I think with respect to maybe some of the telehealth stuff, some of that stuff I think needs to be defined a little bit better so that we can get more targeted solutions. Also, I think that the primary focus for any state money, any state resources that are being committed to this should be for the areas that have no broadband or low bandwidth or high latency. The people that just don't have much of anything, if anything at all, should be the first priority. Those are going to be the higher cost areas, unfortunately, but those are the areas that they at least need something. And so anything the state can do would be helpful, more so than areas that have broadband, but maybe aren't at 100 meg yet or a gigabit service. Also, generally, our position would be that solutions should incentivize private investment. Those would be the preferred solutions. And that solutions that would result in state or government provisioning of service in competition with private providers, well, those would simply chill investment, quite frankly. So those should be avoided. Would note that there are many federal programs in existence and soon to be established that would provide money, will provide money for last mile broadband connections. Some of those we've already talked about, the USDA programs, the RDOF programs. There are some new programs under the CARES Act that could be looked at. And then it seems like there are probably 5 bills a day, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, for in Congress on ways to deploy broadband. With respect to the CARES Act money and telehealth, there is a program, $200 million that was established for the FCC to oversee, and to date, 41 it goes to healthcare providers for stuff that they need for telehealth purposes. And so far, there have been providers in 41 states that have received funding for a total of $84.96 million. And that's out of the $200 million that was expended. Or it's $200 million that was set aside for the FCC to expend. Wyoming hasn't been one of those states yet. So I'm not sure if the program doesn't work for certain healthcare providers, if they're not familiar with it. But there is still over half the money left. And just something to be aware of that maybe that's helpful for this emergency. See what else wanted to mention. Probably just one last thing with respect to the discussion on electric easements. I serve as I serve on the board of the Colorado Telecom Association too. So we operate not just we're primarily in Wyoming, that's where most of our customers are, but we have operations in Montana and South Dakota a little bit, and Colorado a little bit. But I serve on the board of directors for the Colorado Telecom Association. So I'm familiar with the bill that passed down there on the electric easements. I wasn't heavily involved in the bill and how it got passed, but I will say that the electric cooperatives reached out to the telecom carriers, worked on a compromise bill, and the way that it's structured, it actually allows partnerships for telecom providers to use those electric easements. And what the law primarily does is it clarifies that those electric easements can be used for broadband. So there was an engagement between the electric cooperatives and telecom providers there. I reached out to Sean Taylor, and he committed for WREA, and he committed to do a similar kind of process here in Wyoming. And if you look at the chat functions on the YouTube page, it's listed on there in the chat page too, that he posted it, his willingness to work with us. So I did want to point that out, and I think that pretty much wraps it up, unless you have any questions for me.
Jason, thank you for your testimony. Does anybody have any questions of Jason? Not, thank you, Jason, very much. It's good to see you, and we'll shift now to Jody Levin. Jody, oh, there you are. All right, thanks. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, task force members. My name is Jody Levin. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Jody Levin, again, I represent Verizon and Charter. I won't take a lot of your time this afternoon because my colleagues have covered a number of the comments that I intended to provide. I have a few high-level comments on the bills, but I did want to take just a minute to address some comments that I've heard, not necessarily before the task force today, but I believe this is now the fourth committee that has been addressing broadband, either with telehealth or teleeducation. So no doubt it's a very important topic. It's always an important topic, but it's increasingly more important as we live in a COVID world. So in some of the other meetings, I've heard comments about carriers not stepping up and carriers not doing enough. And I wanted to share just a little bit about what my clients have done as some of the larger providers in the state. They also signed the FCC pledge. And so my comments are really about what they did to go beyond the pledge. And I think some of their efforts have been significant. In fact, Forbes just came out with a ranking of the top 25 large corporations in their kind of what they call the corporate responders and what they did to address communities, customers, and employees. And technology, tech type companies, communications companies really dominate that list. I think that's likely to be expected, but we can be proud of that fact. And my clients ranked number 1, Verizon, and number 12, Charter. So I'm proud to represent them and the response that they delivered. Going beyond the pledge, Charter specifically, I should say, on the hotspot question that was asked earlier today, Charter, in signing the pledge, opened up 276 hotspots across the state. And they also, recognizing the need for students to be able to get online and teachers to get online, they offered 60 days of free service to any household that was a new customer. So if you weren't a current customer, but you had a student, including college students, or if you were an educator, you were able to enroll for 60 days of free service, and that goes through the end of June. So you can still sign up and get that 60 days of free service. And as of the beginning of June, Charter has 1,096 households in Wyoming that have taken advantage of that service. So I think that's significant. They also have an ongoing program, and we did a lot around promotion of this, tried to get this information out to as many entities as possible to include in kind of their information about responses. And that's a program called Spectrum Internet Assist. That's for households that are low income or limited income that qualify. So this can even be for seniors, but specific for students, it's for free and reduced lunch. And so that's a program that provides 30 megabits of service for $17.99 a month. That's a great program. We really pushed hard to make sure, as I said, that entities knew about that, and really took a special focus on making sure seniors knew about that program. Knowing income gets tight during these times, there was a lot of concerns about social isolation. So we did significant outreach, as I've said, trying to make sure that entities knew about that. So that's an ongoing program. So to the extent you are in a charter footprint and you have constituents that you think might be eligible for that, please let me know, and we're happy to provide them that information. So just a couple of points, Mr. Chairman, very broadly again on the bills. I won't repeat the comments from Ms. Zerga. I think she hit on a number of the concerns that my clients have. Of course, there's always a concern about these utilizing the unified network in a way that competes with the private sector. So that's just an overarching concern. The remainder of that bill, and that bill is, make sure I've got the right one in front of me, 737. I think that bill, the first 8 pages really address the unified network, and that's the predominant concern of my clients. The remainder of that bill, I think there's a lot that is great about that bill that we can certainly work through. Consistent through all 3 of the bills for my clients is a concern about definitions. Representative Lindholm can laugh or cringe because we deal with this all the time in corporations. Definitions in the communications industry are everything, and they're not consistent across the different types of technologies. So that would be one request. Is I don't have that language ready to provide in terms of an amendment today, but I certainly can. As written, both Charter and Verizon do not believe that they could participate in these programs or these efforts. So we'd like that piece to be corrected. And then to really echo the comments of Mr. Hendricks, when you're talking about where things should be prioritized, we would like to see the priority focus on unserved areas first. We've heard so many comments throughout these committees about problems, gaps in service, coverage area challenges, but we don't ever hear a lot of details about where those are specifically occurring. So we need to focus in, kind of drill down, get to the specifics of that so industry can start to respond and provide responses. But more than that, I think we really need to lift the boats that need to be lifted, and that's those unserved areas. And so we'd also like to push for a focus on getting service to those areas first. Underserved is always a very difficult conversation to have when you talk about potentially overbuilding with public dollars. It's just a hot button in the industry. And with that, Mr. Chairman, those are my high-level comments.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask Ms. Levin a question? Not. Thank you very much, Jody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Brian, who is next?
Mr. Chairman, that is all I had on our list for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we will take 5 minutes, one more 5-minute break, and then we will dig into this. Obviously, it's getting pretty late, but that's the way these meetings go. So 5 minutes, and then we'll be back. Bye. I think we'll wait just a little while longer. Get a few more people back in. Senator Landon, and then he's close. Well, maybe I will just go ahead and start. So, Brian, I think committee, I think my intent would be, we add to these bills if there's other ideas we have, if there's consensus on refining. By consensus, I mean if we can all agree on a revision to a bill, something we heard today that we want to place in it. I think we do that just to give staff the opportunity to do that. But really now, I think I would like to see us add to ideas. And then, so I think just to go through these bills, I think these bills are really lumped into three things. The first bill is a new broadband grant program. The second bill is more about government and broadband. In other words, what the state can do with easements or access or unified network. And then the third one is a supplemental program, obviously, for people that have been laid off or otherwise affected by COVID, where companies have been currently providing some of that, and whether we would want to see that extended during this period. And so with that, Brian, I think if you come on, if you can, if everybody has copies of bills by now, I'm sure. And I think Brian, if you can walk us through, fairly quickly through these bills and just start with the first one. And then at the end of the bill, if anybody has any questions along the way, ask. If not, at the end of the bill, if we want to add or subtract, add things rather than subtract, I think we should, that would be the order that I would want to do it in. So Brian, I think, so let's start with 731.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, and just before I jump into all three of the bills, just one note about them in general is that these were drafted under a rather compressed time frame. So they did not go through all of LSO's review process. They may be subject to a few changes. I have a couple technical things I've already noticed that we'll go ahead and make, but just with that caveat out there. Mr. Chairman, 20 LSO 731, you should have draft 0.6 in front of you. And this draft, in summary, creates a rapid broadband development reimbursement program, where currently, as the way the bill is drafted, CARES Act funds would be used to provide funding for broadband infrastructure projects in the state of Wyoming. Just beginning on the staff comment, just a note, it was mentioned earlier, Article 16, Section 6 states that provides that the state of Wyoming, the state shall not engage in any work of internal improvement unless authorized by a 2/3 vote of the people. There's broad principles on the top of page 2 that outline considerations for the task force to keep in mind as we work through these drafts. On page 2, line 25, these are findings for this program. Many of them are, particularly for the legislative members of the task force, many of these should look familiar as they are based in large part on the findings that were in Senate File 1001 and House Bill 1004 that were considered in the past special session. I would note on page 3, line 14 is a note that as a result of the public health emergency, demand for reliable internet access and internet usage have drastically increased. On line 19, there's a demonstrated need for Wyoming's communities, schools, businesses, and residents to have reliable, high-speed broadband internet access. Page 4, line 1 just notes that CARES Act funds should be used, that this is a priority for use of those funds. And then page 4, line 17, in order to ensure that the public can continue operating effectively during and after the public health emergency, a portion of those funds should be used to promote the development of broadband internet service in the state. Page 5, line 6, this is a non-codified section. This is really the heart of the program. The definitions that are currently in the bill draft include broadband internet service, which provides, which means service by wire or radio that provides the capability for transmitting data, excluding dial-up internet access. Page 6, line 4, governmental entity is a fairly broad definition that includes cities, towns, counties, special districts, political subdivisions of the state. Line 10, infrastructure project, includes both middle mile infrastructure and last mile infrastructure, would be considered as infrastructure projects. Moving on to page 7, this would also be any project designed to provide or expand 5th generation 5G technology for cellular networks. And as noted by previous speakers, this term is not further defined in this current draft. And then paragraph D, or subparagraph D, excuse me, on line 5 of page 7, just provides that any existing project that meets the definitions of so either middle mile, last mile, or 5G, an expansion of that existing project that has already been planned for construction or has had construction commence. Moving on, telecommunications company is a fairly standard definition based on existing statute, on the existing rights of way statute for telecom companies. Line 17, underserved area is just any area where service is between 50 megabits per second and up to a gigabit per second for download speed. And then moving on to page 8, underserved is anything less than 50 megabits per second. And Mr. Chairman, I believe it was also discussed, this is where the language specifically regarding terrestrial was located. I'm just off of, quick memory, I don't believe that specific term is included elsewhere in the bill draft. Just another point of consideration for the task force. Page 8, line 7, this is the language creating the program. The Business Council would be charged with establishing and administering the program to provide stipends for governmental entities and telecom companies to reimburse expenses for infrastructure projects that provide or upgrade broadband service. And then for the stipends that are awarded under this, there's a number of conditions, and those begin on page 8, line 17. First, an application is required. The Business Council would be required to have an application ready to go 21 days after the effective date of the act. The applicant must certify that they're entitled to a stipend for an eligible project, and knowingly making a false statement could result in having to repay all of those funds back to the Business Council. On page 9, line 7, the council must review all applications and issue decisions within 7 calendar days after receiving the application. And if no decision is made in those 7 days, then the application is deemed to have been approved for funding. Page 9, line 14 just provides that the council can contract with financial institutions for operating and administering the program. On line 19, stipends would be awarded to reimburse infrastructure projects authorized or completed by governmental entities or telecom companies to unserved or underserved areas, so long as the project, and then moving on to page 10, would facilitate the compliance of Wyoming residents, communities, businesses, and schools with COVID-related public health measures or orders. It'd be a project that facilitates distance learning or provides tech improvements for facilitating distance learning. It improves telework capabilities for employees of governmental entities, and then D on line 14, page 10, is just a catch-all. Any other project that would be permissible under CARES Act funding. And Mr. Chairman, the rationale behind this particular language is to track with the guidance that the Department of Treasury has provided for use of the CARES Act funds. And there's a staff comment further along in the draft that I'll discuss further, but that's the purpose of that language. Page 10, line 18, if the applicant is a governmental entity, they would first have to develop an RFP for a telecom company to complete the project. And before the governmental entity could apply, the governmental entity would have to put out that RFP and then receive no response from a telecom company or received responses that were justifiably rejected because of the price. Page 11, line 12. This provides that any infrastructure project that receives reimbursement under this section must improve download speeds along with a corresponding improvement in upload speeds in a ratio determined by the council. Line 17, stipends awarded must be awarded for infrastructure projects that commence on or after March 15th and not later than November 1st, 2020. Moving on to page 12, this provides the reimbursement for the projects under this section. So at the top of page 12, for unserved areas, so for projects where existing speeds are less than 50 megabits per second, it would be 100% of the cost. Between 50 and 100 would be 90% of the cost. Between 100 and 200 is 80%. And then between 200 and 1 gigabit would be 50% of the project cost. Moving on to page 13, 5G projects would be eligible for 75% of the reimbursements. And then for an expansion of an existing project, it would be 50% of the cost of the infrastructure project. Page 13, line 11, this provides that all projects must have a measurable improvement in the download and upload speeds. And then provided that each project receiving a stipend must provide at least 50 megabits per second in the fixed terrestrial broadband download speed. On line 19, stipends can only be made with funds provided for the CARES Act and no other funds can be used. On page 14, this provides some priorities for the council to consider in awarding stipends. First, this is page 14, line 5. Priority must be given to projects that are expansions of existing projects. It must take into consideration any other federal funds that a governmental entity or telecom company has received for that project for which a stipend is sought. Stipends may be awarded notwithstanding the existing broadband funding program. That's in 912-1501 through 912-1509. And then page 14, line 20 is rulemaking authority for the Business Council to administer this program. Page 15, line 1, the AG would review the legality of the program in writing. Line 5, subsection F is just that no funds can be made except in accordance with state and federal law. And then G is just allowing the council to conduct random audits of stipend recipients to ensure that funds are expended in compliance with state and federal law. And then the program would terminate on December 30th, 2020, which is the current date by which the CARES Act relief funds provided to the state must be expended. And then, Mr. Chairman, moving to the staff comment, this just notes the CARES Act funds. And moving on to page 16, the verbatim language from the CARES Act for the permissible uses of this fund are provided. There's guidance that's also listed. And then finally, in a recent update, this was, I believe, the last Friday in May, May 28th, I believe was the day, or 29th. The Department of Treasury updated its frequently asked questions to the use of these funds in tandem with the guidance. And one of the questions asked in this updated guidance is, may recipients use fund payments to expand rural broadband capacity to assist with distance learning and telework? And the first sentence answering that is that such expenditures would only be permissible if they are necessary for the public health emergency. And if the cost of the projects wouldn't increase capacity until after the public health emergency, then the CARES Act funds, it would be deemed not to be necessary due to the public health emergency and not eligible uses of those funds. Section 3, this is page 17, line 21, reappropriates $100 million from what is known as the second tranche of that funding, which I believe is $400 million that would become available to the governor on July 15th. So $100 million would come from that for the purposes of these stipends. And then, Mr. Chairman, the effective effective date is immediate. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions about this bill draft.
Senator Dockstader.
Mr. Chairman, Brian, it almost sounded like the Treasury Department was starting to tuck it back in. A little more on that, if you could, please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Dockstader, are you referring to that updated guidance? Yep. Mr. Chairman, I don't know the rationale behind, that question. I imagine, a state must have asked Treasury about the use of those funds for projects. The way I read it is that really it has to be two things. The project has to be completed and increase capacity during the public health emergency. Those are kind of the two big things. It has to be during the public health emergency for that emergency, and the project has to be completed within that time frame. The way I read that guidance as written.
Any other questions of Brian? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, Brian, based on the staff comments and just some other things within the bill, am I reading correctly that the reason we are partnering these telecom companies with a local entity or a government entity is to meet constitutional muster? And can you talk a little bit more about how this money's going to get pointed in that direction, and are we going to be okay there?
So Brian, let me take a bit of that first, and then I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong. So really, this is designed different than our existing grant program in that companies could independently file and get money. The question was, if a governmental entity wished to provide broadband, we didn't want government-owned broadband unless they had went out with an RFP and they did not get a private entity to work with them. So the idea was grant money to private industry. If a public entity wanted to get broadband, they need to go out and have an RFP and show that they don't have any partner that's willing privately to do this work. And then and only then could government own the broadband. Is that fair, Brian?
Well, Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, I appreciate that, and I get that piece of it. I guess a little bit of my heartburn came when there is language in the bill that some of this money would pass through the state of Wyoming, go directly to a private company. I guess that's the piece that I'd like to know a little bit more about, Brian, if you could. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, in terms of the constitutional dimension to that, because of the limited time available in drafting these bills, I wasn't able to fully flesh that out in terms of, really I think the question would be is if, and this gets at really that on page 2, I think the question of, is this the work of the state if the money is passing through to private entities? That is unclear. I think there could be an argument made that it would be, the state conducting that internal improvement. That said, there's also, not in Wyoming, but other states where the source of the funds plays a role in in determining whether there's an internal improvement that would trigger a constitutional limitation. Other state courts have suggested that, with provisions similar to Wyoming, that, the source of funds may obviate that risk. The whole idea behind the provision in the first place was the railroads, the state getting involved and basically losing enormous amounts of money developing this when those private enterprises went belly up. So that's the genesis of that provision. The other question too would be, Wyoming has not, there's no case law saying what is or is not an internal improvement. The Constitution itself gives certain ideas, roads and highways, airports, are, presumably considered those because there are specific exceptions to those in the Constitution. Whether broadband development would be along those lines or not, admittedly could be an unanswered question.
Mr. Chairman, really appreciate your comments in that regard, and thanks to Brian as well. Just much to think about right there.
Senator Landon, Representative Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I want to talk about some of the thought process that I think comes about because of direct funding to private industry is not something that we normally do, and I understand the senator's heartburn when we're looking at this this ideology of broadband and how to expand as fast as possible. Thankfully, Wyoming has some experience in what does not work. And I'm blaming ourselves for this, the Wyoming legislature, because we're the ones that drafted the Broadband Advisory Council's grant program, where as it was, if you'll remember, as that bill was going through the process, the House and Senate sprinkled requirements all over that. And we're still sitting on that $10 million. It's still there. And so the ideology on this, I think anyways, on top of what Brian, Mr. Fuller had just said, is in regards to, let's just make it really super simple. We know there's a group of people out there that know where the holes are and know how to get this done. Let's see if they can run the ball, and we'll just get out of their way, is kind of the ideology, or at least in my opinion. I think whether it works or not is who knows.
And Senator Landon, I think initially, if you read the federal guidance before you read their interpretation of the guidance, it seemed clear that broadband was a legitimate use of those dollars, much like the grant money to businesses that we are providing now. You could make the argument that that's not constitutional. I think what we're saying is that this is more or less a pass-through that we're directing and just creating a way to move the money from point A to point B. Whether that's a correct assumption or not, I don't know, but that I think this was patterned more after that business grant than anything else. Representative Lindholm.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to cover on one more thing, that the ideology between the governmental entity coming forward and having to put out an RFP and those types of things. I mean, technically, the way I understand this, and I guess maybe this would be partially a question for Mr. Fuller, but the way I understand this, that provision would be that the governmental entity, if they couldn't get anybody to RFP and they couldn't get anybody interested, they would then own the conduit and the fiber in the conduit, but they wouldn't necessarily own the broadband. They would essentially be running their conduit and their fiber to much like Kemmerer did with Evanston. And at that point, contracting or leasing said items to a private entity to light it up. Would that be, I mean, generally the way I read it? Is that correct, Mr. Fuller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lindholm, nothing in this bill draft contemplates a governmental entity assuming the role as an ISP or a broadband provider.
Perfect. Thank you.
I guess, so any other questions, just a couple of comments that I'll make that I thought that were good ones brought up. One was the preference for kind of technology. I personally, if we see another draft of this bill, I would like to make sure that we only provide funding to terrestrial broadband and maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, but basically I don't want to see any of this money go to satellite. And so, which is out, that's not companies going to be based in Wyoming. And so that's one thing that I would like to see in there. And then I really thought Liz's other suggestion on, we have all of these things are massageable. They were just numbers placed in there. So we have a 7-day deal. We wanted it to be quick. It's 7 days. If you don't have your, if the business council doesn't act in 7 days, then it's a green light. Certainly there should be a notice to industry that an application has come in. And so I'd like to see that notice be attached. And then let's see. I think the 5G thing, I think there were some good comments there by Representative Yin and others. That idea needs fleshed out. It was simply a placeholder. Some of the other placeholders, and one problem I see in the bill is we don't really want, if you're in an underserved area, whether you like the term or not, we don't want you putting in 50 megabits per second if you're getting 80% funding to go between 100 meg and 200 megs. So it would not make sense that you wouldn't go to 200 megs. So all of that needs to be fleshed out more and revised. And frankly, do we want that many different categories? That was just simply put in there as a way to favor those areas that were most underserved or not served. And I think we heard from providers that, well, we want to see this in unserved areas. Well, unserved means 25.3. If there's nobody in that, if there's one in that census block, then it doesn't, this doesn't count. It gets too restrictive too quickly, I think. So anyway, those are some ideas that I think we could work on. Just curiosity, anybody want to add, subtract from this bill? Senator von Flateren, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had download speed of not less than 50 megabits. Is that, 25.3 is what the national they realize is the national. How can you have 50 megabits and call them underserved?
So, Senator, I think that was entirely a policy decision, believing that probably 25.3 really isn't, in our opinion, probably wasn't served and is unserved. So that's another one of those policy decisions that could be made. We have another place in statute on the current broadband grant program where it is 25.3. And so all of that is up for debate. The idea here was to try to be as open with this grant program as we could possibly be if that money was available. Barbara, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just a few items to add. I agree with most of the conversation, Mr. Chairman. One of the items on page 7, when we talk about line 17, when we talk about unserved area, I know that's a really generic term. As part of the RDOF and a lot of the federal funds, that area is defined as a census block. I am just wondering if it would be useful to define that a little better. I know that there are areas that we serve that are gig and some areas that are wireless that would not be considered gigs, and they are really adjacent to each other in a lot of instances. So just something to think about there. I would second the notice to existing carriers. Also, find it, excuse me. One of the items that you noted, the difference between 50 meg and 100 meg, one of the comments I wrote down was, is there enough of a jump between 50 and 100 meg? Or should we go ahead and remove that and go straight to 200 meg? And then An item that's not noted in this bill is in regards to upload and latency as it relates to both telehealth and education. Those are really two critical factors. We saw an extreme jump in our upload traffic as part of the COVID. And then again, latency from a federal perspective, they're going to less than 100 milliseconds is becoming the standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sessions. And I think all of those are good, good ideas. In fact, I think those different categories, and I'd ask Representative Lindholm this question too. You know, those various categories, we could make it 2 categories. You know, you could make it, there's no magic there as far as why that was picked. I think it was just a starting place to choose from. So if I think if you, Barbara, or anybody else has ideas there, we can, I assume we could get consensus on some of that pretty easily. I don't think there's any, Representative Lindholm.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I fully agree. I mean, everybody's kind of working under a constrained timeline. And this is really honestly a big hat tip to Brian Fuller, because that poor guy was delivered some ideas in a smashed together meeting really quick and said, by the way, you got to have these ready in like a week. And so he did it. I mean, but yeah, we definitely, if we want to reshape that thing to be more concise and more to the point, and actually more towards Mr. Hendricks's point that testified that, you know, let's make a priority out of these areas that have nothing. And we could specifically even put that in the bill, that the Business Council shall make a priority out of all projects where no existing infrastructure exists. And I think by making them a priority, that ensures that they're going to be funded, but it also doesn't cut out anyone else where some major upgrades might be able to be made. So I'm down for a rewrite. It wouldn't hurt my feelings at all.
Senator Dockstader, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because my next question was, how do we formulate what Barbara said? How do we bring it back in? And Brian did a great job considering he was running judiciary at the same time. How do we kind of tighten this back up, and do you want to select a group just to tighten that up with, or how do you want to have it all ready for the next meeting?
So that's a great question. I think what you just suggested is a little subcommittee, and we tighten the language up, get Barbara on that, and we just kind of reshape some of that, or we can do it right now, but I don't know that you want to spend the time to do all of that right now. Speaker Harshman, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just on, thinking about the conversation on no service, and it's on page 6, really, where we define what the infrastructure project is, and it's a middle mile or last mile. And I think about that quick map that YDOT showed, and we don't have access to all the maps, but there was no fiber running up. It seemed like from 85 running up. I don't know, but I guess there might be a need for a long haul on some of this to get somewhere. And the thought that sticks in my head is that eastern corridor. Maybe it's not, but do we want to exclude that? I guess if we're going to really emphasize and pivot a little bit to that, where there's no service.
Mr. Speaker, I think the middle mile in Wyoming is the long haul in many other states. I think the long haul really is those, and Barbara can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically the I-80, the big pipes that are along I-80, and middle mile basically goes from your last mile to some of that. So Barbara, do you have a better definition? Am I correct or wrong?
No, you're correct, Mr. Chairman.
So I think we're good on that end. Representative Lindholm, any thoughts on how we move ahead with this bill? And go any other comments you have?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I think so. I think the subcommittee idea is a good one. And then I also think that Speaker Harshman was trying to add something in there, that he wanted something ran from Hewlett to Cheyenne. And so if that's the case, I'm with him. Hewlett to Cheyenne sounds so good.
So I think what I'll do is I will appoint some people to this, and so I'm going to appoint. Hold it, Ms. Hardesty. Did you have your hand up at one point just recently, or did I remember that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I did. My only question was a couple different times. It's specifically listed out businesses, schools, and governmental agencies that have been impacted. I know we've got several, the second bill we'll discuss has quite a bit of health and healthcare provider related pieces, but I just wondered, just trying to get into the little thinking about maybe why those three were specifically called out. Is it because of CARES? I didn't know if you could help me in my mind why those three kind of categories were called out, and maybe healthcare providers or healthcare in general wasn't included.
Brian, I'm going to throw this back to you. I do know that we did want to highlight those things that were in the CARES Act. Telehealth was one of them. I certainly think that could be added in, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I see no reason why that couldn't be added into these findings.
Okay, well, let's just take a note of that, Brian. And so I think what I'll do is I'll put Barbara, me, and who's the senator that would like to raise their hand for this? If I don't get a senator raising their hand, I appoint the senator. I think Wasserberger's pointed at everybody but him, so I'm gonna appoint Senator Landon. We need to have two wranglers on this deal, I think, to get it right, but I'm not quite sure. So that will be it, and we will coordinate, Brian, with you with a time in the very, very near future to kind of work on this. And Barbara, I'm going to be honest, we're going to lean on you as expertise on what we need to do to kind of clean this up within the bounds of our, while also capturing what we need to do. I think the one thing that, Representative Yin, I might have you sit in on this as well, just to sit in on and do that. The 5G piece we need to alter and change completely. What we do with that, I'm not sure, but I would, I'd like some ideas. Barbara, maybe you can reach out to Jody or others that represent some of those, and you represent, and Liz does as well, and you guys have phone service. So certainly you understand that issue of 5G and 4G and 3G. I think the idea is we want to really connect some city in Wyoming. Maybe it's not doable, or maybe it is doable. So 4G might be the thing, but so let's work on that. Anybody, any other thoughts on this bill? So that will be the group that works on Representative Lindholm.
Yeah, just one final thought, Mr. Chairman, and this is for the subgroup. I don't know that I would put a whole lot of time, into the 5G piece. I think the 5G aspect is interesting, and we certainly want better cell service throughout the state. But I think we're going to do more help for the better cell service throughout the state in a later bill than what we're able to do in this piece of legislation. And the reality is, you need fiber to run 5G. Let's get the fiber done first, is my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on this bill? Okay, we will now go to 737. Brian?
Mr. Chairman, this should be 737 working draft point 4. Broadly, this bill amends or creates various provisions in Wyoming statutes designed to enhance the state support of broadband development in the state. I'll just jump in, page 2, line 19. This creates a new section of statute, and this is the program that has been referred to as kind of the access to the unified network. It provides the state chief information officer must establish a process by which access to the unified network is granted to communities and healthcare providers. Those are defined actually at the end of the bill. You have to flip all the way to page 18 for those definitions. Community, just to hit them now, is a first-class city, an incorporated town, or a census designated place identified by the Census Bureau. So that would be, you know, a place like Daniel, for example. And then, Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 3, access to the unified network is in accordance with the following. So you have to apply to the Chief Information Officer, and applications can only be filed by fire protection districts in the state for the establishment of a wireless access point, wireless internet access point at one of their facilities. For a first-class city or an incorporated town, the governing body of that city or town can apply for placement of an access point at a community center of the town or city. And then for a census designated place, the Board of County Commissioners would apply for placement of an access point at a community center of that census designated place.
Just quickly, Brian, just because this is such a big bill, the thought process was that there in different states, they do different things. Some states provide Wi-Fi spots at fire halls. Some states provide a Wi-Fi spot at community centers. And so we were just throwing this idea out there of a way of providing a Wi-Fi access spot it doesn't have to be all, or, you know, it could be one or the other of those. We just thought that would be a way to get a community Wi-Fi spot set up. So if people needed access, they could go to a parking lot somewhere and actually get some access. And that access would be through the unified network. So that was the idea there. Please go ahead, Brian.
Yep. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 4, the other eligible applicant for access is any healthcare provider, and it's limited to 4 types of providers. It would be a hospital in Wyoming, a community health center, which receives federal funding under that applicable law, a community mental health center, or a rural health clinic. So those would be the healthcare providers that could apply for access to the unified network. The Chief Information Officer, that's the director of ETS, must review the application and must render a decision not later than 15 days after receipt of the application. Consideration must be given to the impact that granting access would have on the unified network. For a community applicant, consideration must be given to that applicant's ability to provide a consistent and stable internet access to the residents of the community at that community center. For healthcare providers, consideration must be given to how the healthcare provider would provide telemedicine services to Wyoming residents, including any communities that aren't served by telemedicine that may be under giving access through giving access to the unified network, and then any other factor that the CIO deems relevant. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 6, line 2, any expansion of the unified network in terms of infrastructure, or if there's any necessary construction associated with the project, the option must be given for a telecommunications company to include its fiber in the construction of any conduit or infrastructure to complete the project. And it provides that any telecommunications company that elects to participate is responsible for the cost of the fiber that would go into that conduit. On line 11, healthcare providers granted access to the unified network can only use it for telemedicine visits or services. It must report monthly to ETS on the use of the unified network, provided that any report would include information that's not deemed confidential or private per state or federal law. Moving to page 7, this provides that any construction or infrastructure or equipment, hardware, software that's necessary for a healthcare provider to access the network is before November 1st, it would be at the state's expense, and there's an appropriation later in the bill with CARES Act funds. And then after November 1st, it would be at the healthcare provider's expense to connect to the unified network if any construction or technology is needed for that. Page 7, line 14, for communities who are granted access, they must establish a wireless internet access point at a community center. And for fire districts, it would be an access point at one of its facilities, or at least one of its facilities, excuse me. And then for the communities, any construction or costs would be at the state's expense, provided that funds are available to cover that expense. Again, it would be really, the idea is CARES Act funds to be used for this. Moving on to page 8, line 4, there would only be one applicant per community, provided that a previous applicant who is no longer providing service, there could be a subsequent applicant to replace that service. There's also language in this paragraph, this is paragraph 7, that allows a community, a joint application from a community and school district to provide a wireless internet access point at a school district facility within that community. And then, Mr. Chairman, line 16, page 8 is just rulemaking authority for the Department of Enterprise Technology Services. The staff comment is just an existing statute that is in the ETS statutes. This is on page 9, where the department can contract with telecom providers to provide telecommunication services to both private schools and private health providers if the Department of Health requests that. So that is the language that's provided on page 9.
Brian, on that statute there, do you know if this statute's ever been utilized?
Mr. Chairman, admitting that the time didn't permit me to look into that, I'm unaware if that statute has been utilized or not. I think ETS is still monitoring. If we wanted to bring them in, Mr. Chairman, that would be up to you to see if they had an answer.
Yeah, curiosity, if somebody from ETS is on the horn, maybe bring them on and we'll ask, and they can at least research it to see if this has ever been utilized. Director Knopp, how are you?
His audio is still connecting. There he goes.
Okay, Director Knopp, if you went away.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Mr. Knott comes back, I think it's great that we brought them in for this piece of legislation. But if possible, I would definitely like to drill down on some questions also once you're done.
Sure, no problem. So Director Knopp, thank you for joining us. We were curious whether this 9/2/2906 has ever been utilized. And it's on page 9 of the bill. And you don't have to answer now if you don't know, but you might take a note and find out for us if this statute's ever been used.
And this is the bold type on page 9.
Correct.
I don't know. Did you guys bring Jason in the room as well?
We did not, but if you want to bring Jason in as well.
Mr. Chairman, I had tried to admit him. It just says he's joining.
Okay. Well,
So
I know my
that,
computer freaked out, so sorry. I don't know. I will find out. I thought Jason just might have a little history there.
Okay, you can find out, that'll be fine. We don't need to spend that much time on it.
You bet.
Representative Lindholm, do you have some more questions? It may be Jason that'll need to answer them, but go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually got a pile of them. Just trying to learn more about the unified network. If this was to be expanded by the state, what would that look like? And so well, I think Jason's joining us right now. He just jumped in, so hopefully he's able to hear some of these questions. And Director, do you know what the original cost was for the unified network?
I do not.
Hopefully Jason does. I think part of it, and my
About
reason
15 million.
Is it about 15 million?
I think so.
Mr. Chairman, so well, and maybe Speaker Harshman, I'm sure you were running the Appropriations Committee at the time, but was part of that funded with federal E-rate funding?
Don't recall. I thought it was all general fund.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just keep rattling.
Representative Lindholm, please go ahead, even though we don't have Jason on yet. We just have him.
Yeah, I'm writing them down, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, so another question would be how many employees does it currently cost the state of Wyoming to keep the unified network up and running and good to go? And what would be a projected idea if we expanded this, specifically considering the 20% budget reduction recommended by the governor?
Okay. I'll find out and get back to you.
Hey guys, I did get on. Excuse me.
Oh, there's Jason.
So Jason, this is Representative Summers. Do you know what the initial cost was of the unified network? And then do you remember whether any E-rate money was used when it was created?
Chairman, I'd have to get I don't remember off the top of my head what the actual number was. It was in I would say, 12 to $14 million, I think, initial ask, but I'd have to get the solid number. That was, like I said, 6 or so years ago. Then we do always, every year we file for E-rate for reimbursement on whether it be the bills or the actual circuit costs themselves based on the free and reduced lunch piece.
Okay. So I think Representative Lindholm, just ask your questions. He'll write them down and he'll get answers, and that way we won't spend quite as much time.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Director's got the first set of questions that I had. And I'm really curious as far as the number of personnel currently required to maintain the system, and what is that projected to look like on an expansion of the system, specifically, especially considering ETS now has to go forward with a 20% reduction recommendation from the governor and report on that. Now, granted, we're the appropriators, legislative branches, so we make that final decision. But I'm guessing that'll hold. And then also,
just a question on that, back to you, Representative Lindholm, to clarify that question. One, we're not filling the pipe now, so there's 100 gig available. So you're really wanting to know, above that, or even to fill what exists today. In other words, there's an amount out there right now, and we're not using it. So you're saying if we were to use the part that's not being used now, would that result in increased employees?
Yes, that'd be my question, Mr. Chairman. And then also, Mr. Chairman, and this is for the director or Jason, whoever can answer it, on the ETS's website, on their main page for the unified network, there's this line that says, simply put, the unified network project is about leveraging the state's education and government broadband demands to promote the growth of capacity for all of Wyoming and enhance private investment in broadband infrastructure without fear of the state as competition. This portion of the bill would be the state competing. And so would you change your website if we pass this? Would you feel that you needed to change your website?
Mr. Chair, I think that would be something we definitely consider.
Any other questions, Representative Lindholm?
No, thank you, sir.
Ms. Sessions, please.
Thank you. Just to follow up, Mr. Chairman, on Representative Lindholm's questions for the director and for Mr. Miller. So the usage that you talk about, is that based on peak usage, or is that now when school's out?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Sessions, that's on a peak usage. Certainly, like currently with everybody at home, it's significantly less than that. Again, we saw, that was the interesting part when everybody was working from home and the children went home. The dynamics of the network certainly changes, as everybody saw, right? So yeah, right now, if I look at the backbone of the unified network, it does not run at 16 gig worth of throughput. I mean, it's probably in the, I can get hard numbers, but it's in the 2 to 4 gig range right now, depending on which link of the network you're looking at.
Follow up, please, Mr. Chairman.
Please go ahead.
So I guess I'm trying to think about the amount of usage during the day when you have the state, the school, and potentially healthcare providers all utilizing this network during the day. As industry, we try to offload daytime traffic versus residential traffic to design our networks. I'm just curious if you think there's going to be a need for an increase in that 100 gig core at some point, and if so, how soon?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Sessions, I don't really foresee an increase to the 100 gig backbone in the near future for sure. There's certainly a significant overhead or blue sky above us on those backhauls, and like I said, I'm looking at the live data right now, and one of the links has running right at 2 gig worth of utilization. And like we saw the most utilization in the past few years was, like I said, pushing at that 16 gig across the unified network. And that's the 100 gig pieces. And again, that includes data that's going to our data centers, that kind of stuff as well. So I personally wouldn't see an increase to the backbone speeds necessary for the foreseeable future.
Please go ahead and follow up your session.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, one more follow-up question, if I could, please. Are you required to reserve a certain amount of bandwidth for the education portion of that? If you're allocating 50%, is 50% of the bandwidth reserved for the schools?
Jason?
Chairman Summers and Barbara, yes. Once we get to the point where we'd have to, when we get to the 50 gig worth of utilization, we would implement the same kind of structures we did with, if you remember my old presentation from earlier today, it seems like ages ago, right? But sure, for you guys more so than me, right? But how we allocated that piece of the internet piece coming out of the state network is we divvied that up straight up 50-50 up the middle for that 5 gig internet connection that we had. The reason for that was exactly like you're saying, on the E-rate side, we're making sure we keep that as solid as we can. Currently right now, since we're not using, the numbers don't really add up for the necessity of, for lack of a better term, like QoSing or some type of segmenting that traffic so that we have limits on how much each side can use. We've not implemented any of that, but that certainly would be something that we would have to discuss and address as we've gone, but we've not come anywhere near having a conversation to have to actually implement anything along those lines.
Thank you.
Any other follow-ups, Ms. Hardesty?
It's another point of clarification, I guess. So as I read this, Mr. Chairman, we're talking about one applicant per community, correct?
Yeah. Ms. Hardesty, yes, as this is contemplated on the community center, it would be one community center. And I believe, even though I'm not sure that's the way we intended it, I think it might be just one fire hall in a district as well. And so there sometimes some districts have multiple fire. I think there's 200 and some fire halls in the state of Wyoming. I just found that out in the last few days. Ms. Hardesty, you follow it?
Yeah, that's Mr. Chairman. So this is not saying that healthcare providers have to use the unified network, just like we're not saying school districts can only use the unified network. It's just an opportunity to tap into an existing state legislative funded, potentially underutilized system in order to increase access to healthcare. Is that how I'm understanding it as we're proposing it? So it's just an opportunity, that definitely needed opportunity.
Yeah, it would be an opportunity, and if it was done within a certain period of time, it would be pretty much free because the state pays for that service. And under this, I believe the way it's written, the state would pay for that continued use. After a certain date, the entity would have to pay for the hook into the unified network, but not for the continued service of it. At least I think that's the way it's written, but I'd have to ask Brian Fuller that. Are there any other questions on this piece so we can roll through the rest of this bill? Oh, Speaker Arson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So really, I think the one thing is, that works great for Daniel, doesn't work for Casper, and our big cities. But I think the idea, folks, is what we're trying to, and really every state does this, probably except our state, and really trying to establish some community anchors. And as the chairman said, a lot of states use churches. They got empty parking lots until Sunday, and to have some of this, some of that. And then as far as trying to pull some of the safety and the telehealth, I don't think anybody's talking about putting all of the healthcare systems, traffic on there. We're talking specifically about telemedicine, not about personnel files and all the other stuff. It's really about trying to connect our state into a hub and a spoke of telemedicine. I think the other part there, though, it's really important, is about the ability for private industry to go ahead and lay their cable in there when the street's open. I mean, they're going to lay their cable in there basically for free. I think is a huge deal, and other states have done this where takes a serious chunk of the cost off, and be able to expand it then to all your downtown businesses and all along that trunk. So I think that's really important. But so that's the idea, is just the anchor piece. We thought fire halls, maybe it's not fire halls, but most of Wyoming has a fire hall. So that's where we're going with it. So thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think those are great points by the speaker. And one aspect, or I think that before this first portion of this bill gets too fast underneath of it, I think the reality is we should probably hear from hospitals saying they need this to be able to actually conduct telehealth, because they were conducting telehealth and still are, and are expanding on that without this right now. So do they need that? And I haven't heard that. And then number two, I would like to hear from the cities, because I don't think the cities have probably, I don't know if they're listening right now, but the reality is if the state buries more fiber in their right of way, that's a municipal franchise fee that they will not be getting. And so that might be problematic for them. Now, granted, the state put some limits on those franchise fees in this last session, but that's still a chunk, or at least a decent portion of revenue for the cities. So something to think about.
good point. We will hear more debate as we move along. So, Brian, I think we will move along. And so if we can get through the rest of this bill, that would be great.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Moving on now to page 10, this is creating 24.2.117. This is, I guess, colloquially the DIG 1 statute. It defines broadband internet service exactly as the previous bill did, includes definitions for a broadband conduit, and then on page 11, line 5, just a definition for road project, which would be any project that's commenced under existing statute by the Department of Transportation. Page 11, line 11, this provides that all road projects commenced or performed on or after August 1st, 2020. Mr. Chairman, that was just really a placeholder. No rhyme or reason for selecting that specific date. But any road project after a date certain must include the installation of broadband conduit as part of the road project, provided that there is no existing broadband conduit in the location of the road project. And then the director of the Department of Transportation and the chief engineer must ensure that, and then what follows are just basically industry practices based on a federal law that was considered about a decade ago. So the size of each conduit, moving on to page 12, handholds and manholes, including a pull tape for the installation of fiber optic cable, and then the depth of the conduit. And then page 12, line 15 just provides rulemaking authority for the Department of Transportation for implementing this section. And Mr. Chairman, I received an email regarding Director Reiner wanting to comment on the bill draft, and I'm not sure if he meant this section or another one, but I think he's in the call now.
Director Reiner. You're muted, Director.
Mr. Chairman, I'm now unmuted, and I'm prepared to answer any question you might have, but I'm probably 4 minutes behind you.
Okay, we just started the section on YDOT on page 10 and 11 and 12. So we don't have any questions right now, but if you have a comment, we're willing to listen to it. Otherwise, I think we'll just let Brian continue this section. And then if you have a comment, Director Reiner?
Mr. Chairman, I would, the last thing I heard was the August 1st, 2020 was a placeholder. And I would thank you for making that a placeholder, because that is we've probably let the jobs that are going to be starting in August with already, the job descriptions. So I would certainly want to push that into the future, and would ask the chairman to allow me to get with my chief engineer and say, hey, what would be a reasonable date? The other comment, Mr. Chairman, on this, and maybe if you've already talked this, I apologize, is we don't do a lot of these projects right now. And so if this is our solution, my recommendation to you would be it's too slow. And if we want conduit in the right of way, then I think we should just do it, because we have 6,733 miles. We've pulled way back on new construction. We are maintaining our assets. And I just don't see us realistically doing many of these at all. In fact, I pretty much have put a moratorium on new construction. We're finishing, the ones that were already in process, in works, but we're going to do very, very few of these. And so I would just share that with you in terms of the effects of this legislation may not be what we would desire as a state. Over.
Okay, thank you, General Reiner. So Brian, I'm just going to keep pegging along here, so take off.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, moving on, this would be a new part of the bill, 36.1.122. And what this section does is basically provides that and I'm looking specifically at page 13, line 14, that no fees, rents, or other charges can be charged to or collected for the use of state lands and school trust lands from any person who constructs or maintains broadband infrastructure and cellular towers on those lands. It provides that any construction must be in accordance with law. There must be an application to the Board of Land Commissioners first, and then the infrastructure or cell tower constructed and maintained on those lands must be for Wyoming residents, students, and businesses if on state lands, and for school trust lands, those projects must be for the benefit of public schools and Wyoming students. And then it also provides on page 14, line 15, that any person who causes damage or destruction to those lands as a result of the infrastructure is liable for those damages. And then, Mr. Chairman, just the staff comment on page 15 and then going all the way through the next page, page 16, those are just constitutional provisions for the task force to consider. You know, there was insufficient time to really research this issue carefully, but the purpose of having those in there is just to point out that, you know, there may be a potential issue with using, you know, school lands and state lands in this manner. You know, really it's a question of, you know, are these consistent uses of the land? Are these uses of the land consistent with the state's role as beneficiary of the lands that were granted to the state in the act of admission? So that's the purpose of having those provisions in the bill draft.
And so currently, state lands would, if they permitted one of these, the lease rate would be based upon a comparable private lease rate, that sort of thing, right? Brian, is that your understanding?
I think currently, Mr. Chairman, that would most likely be how those lands are leased out.
Senator Von Flateren.
Thank you. Mr. Fuller, could we, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Fuller, could we possibly charge $1 a year for that and comply with the constitutional requirements?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Von Flateren, I think that the question would be, you know, whether, you know, what amount is the amount that is consistent with the state's role as really a fiduciary, you know, in managing these lands for the stated beneficiaries, you know, for, you know, particularly for the school lands, you know, the beneficiaries, you know, the public schools of Wyoming. I think the question would be, is $1, you know, per year for a lease consistent with that duty?
And I think, you know, Brian and others and Senator, I think the reason we put the language in that you really have to touch school children. So if you're providing the last mile, then we felt, you know, there's school children going to benefit from that. So why would that not be a beneficial use of school land? So that was the reason we put in that part of it, because frankly, it's going to, if it affects the last mile, it's going to affect school children. So, but it is a question, and that is why he's listed the constitutional provisions. So Brian, please continue.
Mr. Chairman, I'm moving on now to the top of page 17, and this is an amendment to an existing statute, to the existing statute, actually 126.813, for providing rights of ways for telecommunications companies to obtain permission. The way the statute currently reads, any public utility or communications company that wants to set and the term used is facilities or fixtures, must obtain permission from either the City Council or the State Transportation Commission or the Board of County Commissioners, depending on the, you know, where the project would be. The amendments here would change that to provide that a telecommunications company would apply first, and then upon receiving an application, that applicable entity, whether it's the governing body of the city or the State Transportation Commission, must issue those permits, licenses, or authorizations for granting that right of way. And it must do so not later than 7 calendar days after receiving the application. And then on page 18, line 4, this would just add a new subsection C to clarify
Just
that.
quickly, Brian, just on that 7 days, there was nothing magical about 7. The whole idea was to make it sooner rather than later. So that's, you know, it was that in of itself is just a placeholder, just an urgency placeholder.
And then, Mr. Chairman, just for subsection C, this would just clarify that the fixtures and facilities that are contemplated in subsection A would not include permanent towers along or across those roads or streets or waters. And then, Mr. Chairman, if there aren't any questions, I'll move on. And Mr. Chairman, I will also note that I believe this was mentioned earlier in the day, but 126.505, it's an existing statute. It's not in this bill. But if a telecommunications company is unable to gain access under this section, it does have the power of eminent domain subject to the requirements of that section to secure space for the right of way. On page 18, line 9, these definitions are amendments that go along with the unified network portion of the bill. So this defines community. It defines community center, which is really a building or facility that is owned, leased, or rented and operated by a community for public functions. And then there's a definition of telemedicine that makes clear that it's not services by phone, text, email, or facility or fax. Really, it's just diagnosing, consulting, treating, and providing management for a patient, between a patient and a healthcare provider. Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to page 21. This is just a one sentence, a conforming amendment to 24-108. Just says that any road construction works, road projects must comply with the new section that was created for the dig ones. Mr. Chairman, 24-116. This existing statute currently allows WYDOT to lease excess capacity on its infrastructure or facilities only if it's necessary to provide telecommunication services to underserved areas of the state. The amendment in this bill draft would strike out that reference to underserved. And then moving on to page 22, it would provide currently the rate of the lease for those projects is a reasonable market-based rate that the Public Service Commission would determine. This amendment would change that to $1 for each year of the lease. Mr. Chairman, moving on the bottom of page 22, section 3 appropriates $100 million of the CARES Act funds to the Department of Enterprise Technology Services for the Unified Network project. It also provides that basically by November 1st, the department must estimate the amount of funds that are expended, obligated, or needed, and then any amount in excess of that estimate rolls back to the governor for use consistent with the priorities that are listed in Senate File 1001, which are various priorities related to expending those CARES Act funds. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 24, this would require the Department of Transportation to petition the United States and the applicable federal agency for broad form or blanket easement for rights of way for telecom companies along public roads located on or through federal lands in Wyoming. Section 5 requires the Department of Transportation to proceed to seek approval from the governor to proceed before August 15th, and then send a copy of this act to the Wyoming congressional delegation, as well as seek their support in any application that's filed under Section 4. Page 25 just requires the director of the Department of Transportation to convene an unpaid working group to work on any application that would be filed under Section 4. And then, Mr. Chairman, the effective date would be immediate.
So I think in order to save time, I'm just going to appoint a subcommittee. I think if there's anything that we want to add to this, obviously, if we decide not to do pieces of this bill, we'll decide that later. But I think for now, I think I will appoint a subcommittee. And I think I'll appoint Ms. Hardesty, Speaker Harshman, and Senator Von Flateren to this. And I'll make Speaker Harshman the chair. I didn't make a chair on the last one, so I will make that chair Senator Landon that was on the last one. So I think and with this, I would also like, maybe Barbara, you be kind of a consultant on this one as well, because I know you guys have a lot of interest in this. So you'll have sections you don't like at all, but one thing that you did bring up was that acronym that I have no idea what it is, that SD-WAM thing. And so that might be brought up, and that could be a potential substitute for the other piece if that's something that the subcommittee thinks is worth looking at. And so Senator Von Flateren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we make this a separate bill? Are we allowed to do that, to make this part of whatever it was way back at the beginning, a separate bill? Geez, I can't even find it. 24-117, which is on page 10. Can we make that a separate bill? I mean, that's a prerogative of our subcommittee, or should we leave it all in the same bill?
So that's been debated, and I think let the subcommittee make that decision. I think I actually had that piece drafted as a separate bill. I think this is designed where you could pull it out as a separate bill. I guess the question is, do we want to do that? And I think that subcommittee could bring that suggestion back if that's what they chose to bring back. Fair enough? Brian, am I correct that you have pulled that out? That's not something that's not doable because it's already been done.
Mr. Chairman, are you referring to the YDOT dig once language?
Oh, no, I'm not. Oh, sorry.
Because I believe that was Senator Von Flateren's question.
Yeah, Senator Von Flateren, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the unified network piece.
No,
you're talking about the dig once piece?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it is 24-2-117, which starts on page 10 of this bill, is what I was thinking would be a separate bill.
Let's let that subcommittee work on it. I think Director Reiner said this probably wasn't going to gain us what we needed. So I think the question would be, what would gain us what we want? Do we want to actually look at those sections of road that don't have conduit and actually have them plowed in? I think those are questions that could be brought back from that subcommittee. So I think leave it in for now, examine it, and then decide where you want to go with it. So, any other questions for now? So, Speaker Harshman is chairman of that committee. Senator Landon is chair of that other subcommittee. And now we'll go on to the final bill.
Mr. Chairman, really quick.
Senator Dockstader.
Before we leave that, I was switching locations. Did we get the question regarding the payment, the constitutional question ironed out, or is that going to be for a subcommittee approach?
Payment, a little more detail.
Well, Senator Von Flateren said at one point, can there be a payment of $1 or something like that? We still have I'm not sure if we're clear on that just because I was switching locations.
Got it. So that, Brian, this is on the state lands issue, whether a dollar helps satisfy that condition or not satisfy that condition. And
Yep.
and I think you mentioned something, but go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Dockstetter, I guess just to summarize, you know, the question I think with the rate of the lease, you know, would be, is no lease or no fees, or is a low amount, say $1 per year, is that in accord with the state's fiduciary duty to manage these lands on behalf of the beneficiaries? I think that, you know, that question is, you know, my very limited research, I'm not sure is one that's been answered, but just one, really, you know, the intent of including those provisions in the bill draft, the constitutional provisions, just to make the committee aware, or the task force aware, that these could be issues that may come up with that new 361122.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to 745.
Mr. Chairman, you should have draft point 2 in front of you. This bill draft would establish a temporary broadband assistance program that the Department of Family Services would operate for providing payments for internet service during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Page 1, line 11, it just jumps right in and creates the program. It notes that the program would be for the necessary support of the poor and in order to ensure continued broadband internet access for residents during the public health emergency. Page 2, line 6 provides that awards can be granted in accordance with the following. So there must be an application, and each applicant must be a Wyoming resident, and then eligible to receive certain kinds of services, which would be either Medicaid, the reference to 76106H paragraph 1 includes eligibility for the temporary assistance for needy families, emergency aid to the elderly, disabled, and children, poverty-related veterans benefits, the SNAP, so the Supplemental Nutrition Program, Medicaid, and Supplemental Security Income, or that the person has a gross annual income of less than 125% of the current federally established poverty level guidelines for the family unit. An applicant must also certify on page 3, line 4, that the internet service is necessary for teleworking, for schooling, for remote online schooling, or telehealth visits. Page 3, line 20, so awards would go from the department to the telecommunications company, who would then apply a discount or a credit to the applicant's monthly bill. Page 4, line 4 provides that awards are limited to the lesser of the monthly bill or $20. Awards would continue until the applicant is no longer eligible, there are no remaining funds, or December 30th, whichever occurs first of those 3 events. Page 4, line 15, awards that are provided are conditioned upon the telecommunications company that receives the payments agreeing not to discontinue service during the time period to which any award payments apply, and then not increasing the amount charged unless there's an existing contract that provides for that. Page 5, line 6 requires the Department of Family Services to promulgate any necessary rules, which can include reporting requirements for awards that are granted under this program. And then the program terminates on December 30th, 2020. The bottom of page 5, basically to the end of the bill, is $1 million of the CARES Act funds that are appropriated to the Department of Family Services, with any excess rolling over to the governor on September 15th. And before that date, DFS would have to basically come up with a number of obligated funds, expended funds, and necessary funds to run the program. And then the excess of that estimated amount would roll back to the governor for use consistent with Senate File 1001. And then this would be effective immediately.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And so this one was put together rather quickly. Telecom, we all received a letter from Liz, and this was one of the recommendations. So we quickly created this just to have that as an option, since it was an option brought forth. We've heard from DFS. And so I think, at the very least, we will have to follow back through with DFS to see what the impact is. I don't know that this takes a subcommittee. I think this is just, it is what it is. I guess I would ask, I don't think I've assigned Senator Dockstetter or anything. Maybe he can touch base with DFS, with Director Smith, and just find out more detail on what they think the impact to their agency would be and whether this is even feasible without an expansion of. Go ahead, Senator Dockstetter.
Mr. Chairman, before I do that, and in those working on this committee, is this what we are, does this fall under what we're tasked to do? I'd like a little feedback from the committee before I do that, and I will take your direction as well, sir.
Sure. I mean, as far as if you think about, I think Brian, when we did management council and we had those 4 broad categories, I believe the last one was internet to the poor, right? Something like that. You remember, you have that written down?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that in front of me. I do recall, at least for the COVID topics, was just funding and opportunities to promote rural broadband access and increase capacity for telemedicine and distance learning. That at least was the broad directive for the COVID related topics. I'll need to go back and look a bit on the broadband topic specific.
And I guess Senator Von Flateren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at this, it'll be mid-August before we get this done, or the rules are done. So in July, we may have a special session and we'll vote on this bill. And should this bill pass, it'll go into August before the DFS gets the rules together. And then it'll be $20 a month times 1,000 people, maybe, if you get that many. You have right on the beginning, you have, if they've lost their job, employment, but then you have completing telework from home. So that's kind of a, like both lost your job, but you have to telework from home. So, and the first couple months, the kids will be out of school, then they'll go back to school. So, or it should say, or on line page 3, line 8, should say, or children residing within the applicant's household to complete schoolwork. I don't see how. So we have to pay them for all of August, which means we're paying a couple, 3 weeks of not being in school. And then we pay them all through December, hoping that so this might work out to be a couple $1,000 maybe. It just doesn't seem that it would be worth per person in DFS having to be assigned to this and then learning all the ISPs for that length of time. It doesn't seem like it's really worth the effort.
Other thoughts? I'm not married to this bill either. We just, because it was a suggestion, we brought it forward. Representative Lindholm.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm kind of sitting in the same spot as Senator Von Flateren in regards to this legislation, considering there's also a federal program out there that does provide some money in this regard. I just don't think it's going to be utilized that much, number one, and number two. And I think we can spend our time better on other projects.
Is there anybody who wants to salvage this bill? Okay, that decides that. We don't need to. Senator Dockstetter, you very handily got out of that subcommittee of one, didn't you?
Just narrowing our work down, Mr. Kenny.
Yeah.
He's one of my heroes, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. So I guess the question then is to the group, and we'll be brief, but I just want to go around the whole group and find out if there's any other suggestions. And I'm just going to take them in order of my screen here, so I have them. So are there any other suggestions, any other things you think we could do, anything we could add to either bill that would really move broadband forward or get to anything we want to get to? Or Senator Landon, I'm just going to start with you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very intrigued by what the state to the south of us did with regard to electrical transmission corridors. And I wondered if that's not something that we should have drafted up so that we can take a look in our next meeting. It just feels like to me that that's an opportunity we could give to broadband development that's as good as any as I've come across the last week or so. So I guess I would propose that. We have a bill that I think has been shared with everyone, at least on the legislative front, and with our staff, with Brian. And so why can't we consider drafting a bill based on what was successful down south?
Speaker Harshman.
Thank you. And I wrote this note. I probably should have said something too, but I think that the previous bill, and this is a note I thought, and I got appointed to the, must have left or something. I got appointed to chair that little subcommittee on 737, but that all talks about easements in there. And I'm just wondering, I was going to ask Brian, actually, I thought it'd be a good bill to put that in. That'd be just another little section in that bill. If we do have a special session, fewer bills, the better. But I was thinking it would fit in there. But Brian, you think you can fit that in the title?
Mr. Chairman, Speaker Harshman.
You can change the title. I mean, it's not a bill draft.
The title is quite broad. State support of broadband internet development. I think having taken a very cursory look at that Colorado legislation, it was 20 pages. So fitting that neatly into this already fairly lengthy bill, I'm not sure. I mean, I'll take a closer look, but distilling it into something smaller than that, I'll have to look and see.
So who's on that? Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, who is that? That's Senator Von Flater, Ms. Hardesty.
So, Mr. Speaker, the subcommittee is you, Ms. Hardesty, Senator Von Flateren, and Barbara Sessions is kind of a consultant.
So how about we do this with Senator Landon's request? If we don't put it in there, we'll pop another bill out then. Would that be all right, Mr. Chairman? Would that be to work? Just work with Brian on that.
It would be Representative Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a request for Speaker Harshman and his subcommittee. Could you be sure to work on the definitions in that legislation? Specifically, it calls out telecom companies are capable of going after these grants, but cable and wireless companies are not considered telecom companies, and yet they provide a lot of broadband in the state of Wyoming. So we need to get that fixed. Ms. Sessions,
So
is that right?
Representative Lindholm, are you talking about the grant program or the government bill?
The grant program.
737 or the grant program?
The grant program, I'm sorry.
So the grant program, that would be Senator Landon is the chair of the subcommittee on that.
That's right. My apologies.
And
Mr. Chairman, remind me who's on there with me. I'm kind of like the speaker. I was looking left and it came in from the right side.
It's you as chair, me, Ms. Sessions, and Representative Yin. And this, and I'll be honest, we'll send an invite out to Representative Lindholm as well, because it's kind of his creation anyway. I should have had him on there instead of me. In fact, I will. Since I am chair, I will just take myself off and put Representative Lindholm on.
You were doing great. I think you should stick with what you got, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
I'll stick with what I got, but I'll stick with what I have, but we'll let Representative Lindholm sit in on that. All right. So I've talked to Senator Landon, and he's provided some comment. Senator Wasserberger, have you got any thoughts about how we promote broadband in Wyoming and actually get further along than we are now?
Mr. Chairman, I'm with Senator Landon, and I spoke about that earlier. It sounds like the subcommittee is going to try and write that into the bill for electric transmission using those lines. That makes great sense to me. That's kind of where I'm at. So not much more.
Thank you. Senator Von Flateren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really think that, you know, with working with the subcommittee, that we should possibly make this out of two bills, make two bills out of this one and separate those. But I think it's, you know, what's it, 4:30 now? And so we had to work a little later than I expected, but I'm glad you didn't labor over every bill and amend it per our deal. And so we're going to do a subcommittee, and that's a great idea.
And we'll also probably receive comments along the way that each subcommittee can then look at as well.
Exactly.
Barbara, do you have any thoughts, anything that we can do that you've thought of that would kind of move the needle? I mean, it's, you know, you guys are the ones that do this stuff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's been great ideas today. One of the topics that we didn't really discuss that may come up in one of the subcommittees is around the standardization of easements and permitting and costs around municipalities and counties. I know we have substantial costs going into some of our counties before we can ever place a tower or dig. So something to perhaps address as well.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hardesty?
Mr. Chair, I don't have any comments. I just appreciate the opportunity to provide some perspective on telehealth and learn more about broadband. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Yin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I will agree with the two senators that I 100% agree on looking at that state to the south of us legislation. And I think also something I noticed in Ms. Delancey's presentation was internet access points for buses. I think that's a very simple CapEx that we could also allow school districts to apply for. So I think it would be interesting if we had a bill that allowed CARES Act funding for that, because it would also be very quick to implement as well, just access points in all the buses. And I have a lot of notes on 737, but I will email those to the subcommittee to think about.
Okay. And I just on that note on the buses, the Wi-Fi on buses, I think that would fit into that second bill, that 737. It's kind of government stuff, so I think it might fit in there. So I guess Speaker Harshman can put that on his list. Representative Lindholm, any thoughts on, now that you've chewed around all of this, any other ideas you have?
No, unless we want to kill half that one bill right now. Do you want to do that now or later, Chairman?
I want to do that later.
I will second what Representative Yen said. Ms. Delancey brought up a great point in her presentation that we do have that opportunity to provide Wi-Fi hotspots in those buses. And I think, boy, that'd be a really clever way and a real benefit that we could provide.
All right, Senator Dockstader.
Thank you, Chairman Summers. You and I know that we've we've been through this a long time, and I would just say that this is probably the closest we are to actually getting something done. It's not 10 years, it's not, maybe not 5 years. This is now, it's the immediate future. We have the opportunity to get this done working under the environment that we have right now. So now that we have these subcommittees and working groups, let's push forward and make it as near in the future as we can and get something done this time. Appreciate all your work, Mr. Chairman, and everybody on the committee.
Thank you. Speaker Harshman, any more ideas?
No, I think, I think though, I just everybody keep an open mind, and I think there's a reason why we're, I don't know, Chairman, that study you had 46. I got on the Wyoming Business Council's website today and did my own little internet test. I'm sitting here. I think I have great internet, and I'm 22 down, 9 up. And look at that map. It's kind of interesting. Start looking around. I was perusing that today some, and that's on the Business Council website. I think we can do a lot better. And I think some of this, we just got to let some of this go, and we're going to be all right. And I think look at opportunities to really expand the private industry on some of these digs on some of this and get fiber everywhere. And it's hard in Wyoming because we're big and we don't have many customers. So it's hard to make a business case for it. So here's a chance for us to come in and help a little bit and provide some safety, some health, some education benefits for everybody. And connectivity, man. Everybody's doing this now. This is how everybody runs their business on this thing. And I'm sitting here a mile from the city limits and I got one little bar. I can't even call from my own house. So I think we can do better. So let's go to work.
Senator Wasserberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to ask that we go ahead and try and look at putting internet on our buses so that students can use that when they're traveling. I think that would be a really worthy thing to use this money for. So I'm going to agree with Representative Lindholm.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Senator. And, you know, I would also suggest to the committee that had the subcommittee on 737 that they get the telehealth, a couple of people from the telehealth network. Ms. Hardesty, you probably know who they are. And they need to be in on that conversation. If there's not a need for anything, if they're good to go, then if they are, I hear that, right? I hear that out there. We need to understand where their challenges are and where there's not challenges. So I think it's incumbent upon that subcommittee to look at that. You know, I want to go back to the very beginning real quickly and say we went down this path before 2 years now. And I know Barbara, Jason, I know who else, me, Senator Dockstader, we've been on that committee, on that council. And at first I was insulted when Representative Lindholm said, we ought to just take their money. They haven't done anything. And now I'm at the point where I want to take their money. They haven't done anything. And it's nothing against that group. I'm a part of it. It's the fact that we have not allowed ourselves to be successful. And if we have the mindset where we're going to be insular and we're just going to protect our own turf, we're going to go down and we're going to be 46th next time, 46th the next time, and 46th the next time. That doesn't mean that good things aren't happening, but they're happening faster every place else. And so we need to really, and I look at you, Barbara, because you're the face of industry on this committee. We have to do this in partnership with you. We have to figure out a way to move the needle with you guys. And I don't know what that is. We've thrown a lot of mud on the wall, but we don't want to be last. We want to be first or second or third or fifth. We just can do better. And so I think that's the challenge to this group. We don't need another committee, right? We don't need another subcommittee. But the question is, can we get something done and can we advance this state? And I think we can. So let's do that. Let's work on it. So thank you, everybody. Does anybody else have a final comment? Senator Doxter.
Just really quick, we won't have an opportunity like this again with this committee, this focused and having the funding available to go. This is our opportunity right now, whether it's getting on a bus or getting it into a community. This is the time.
All right, thank you. I thank everybody for their participation, and I would like to tell everybody that stuck with us in the public and all of those lobbyists with the special interest, please get us your comments shorter rather than longer. I guarantee you these subcommittees are going to look at short comments, not long comments. We look forward to your comments, and we look forward to your comments prior to the next meeting. So with that, thank you, everyone, and I bid you a good day. Thanks.